Power does not always announce itself with uniforms or medals. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by men who hold clipboards and fountain pens instead of rifles. In Nazi Germany, the organization that controlled fear, that decided who vanished and who survived, was not an army division or a famous SS unit. It was a structure built from paperwork, signatures, sealed envelopes, and whispered orders. The Sicherheitspolizei, the SS security police, operated not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the shadowed corridors of offices and interrogation rooms. They controlled identification cards. They controlled movement, they controlled information, and eventually, they controlled life and death. In a dictatorship, the most dangerous weapon is not the soldier. It is the man who decides who the soldier is allowed to shoot. The Sicherheitspolizei, often shortened to SiPo, began as two seemingly ordinary institutions: the criminal police and the secret state police, the Gestapo. Together, they formed a hybrid machine designed to erase the line between law enforcement and political obedience. The world had seen secret police before, but never like this. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, they combined investigative power with ideological loyalty. Imagine a system where detectives, prosecutors, and executioners all report to the same man, and where the law itself becomes a weapon against the people it was meant to protect. Inside their offices, the smell of tobacco and typewriter ink filled narrow hallways. Thousands of index cards documented neighbours informing on neighbours, co-workers denouncing co-workers, husbands betraying wives. The SiPo grew not by brute force, but by turning fear into currency. A whisper became evidence, a rumour became a file became an arrest. It was said that once your name entered their cabinet drawers, you did not come out. When war exploded across Europe in 1939, the Sicherheitspolizei travelled with the army, not as soldiers, but as architects of control. While Wehrmacht officers mapped roads and bridges, SiPo officers mapped human beings. They identified problem categories, classified populations, and prepared deportation lists. Their briefcases contained not maps, but forms, not ammunition, but stamps. A typed report could condemn more people than a rifle company. When the invasion of Poland began, alongside the army marched something far darker: SS Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units drawn from the SiPo and SD. These were not battlefield units. They followed behind, combing towns and villages, identifying targets through lists prepared in advance. Priests, teachers, intellectuals, community leaders, people who could inspire resistance. The Sicherheitspolizei turned ideology into procedure, and procedure into death. They stood at the intersection of bureaucracy and murder, proving that genocide does not require rage-only organisation. In France, in the Netherlands, in Norway, everywhere the German army went, the SiPo followed. Their methods evolved. Intimidation became interrogation. Interrogation became torture. Torture became disappearance. They designed networks of informants. They learned how to break families, how to fracture trust, how to keep entire populations afraid with the smallest display of power. A knock at the door at night, a missing neighbour, a rumour that someone went east. The SiPo did not pull the trigger at the camps. They supplied the names. Inside their files were the blueprints of the Holocaust. When the Reich Security Main Office RSHA absorbed them, the SiPo ceased to be a police force. It became the administrative heart of terror. If the SS were the body, the SiPo were the nervous system. Every order, every deportation train, every legal justification of theft and murder passed through their desks. They typed the laws that stripped Jews of citizenship. They wrote the decrees that allowed the Gestapo to arrest without warrants. They created a world where injustice wore the mask of legality, and the most chilling lesson they left behind was this: evil does not need chaos. Evil thrives in structure. By the war's end, when Nazi Germany collapsed and Allied soldiers opened the camps, SiPo officers fled. Some burned files, some disguised themselves, some melted into the civilian population. They understood better than anyone that silence was survival, because they had spent years weaponizing silence against others. The Sicherheitspolizei was not an army. It was not a battlefield unit. It was a system, and systems are harder to destroy than soldiers. Tonight, we return to that world, to the offices where typewriters replaced bullets, to the desks where men decided who would vanish, to the moment when law was twisted into a blade. This is the entire history of the Sicherheitspolizei, the SS security police, the bureaucrats of terror, and proof that the most terrifying weapon in a dictatorship is the man who decides the rules. Before we begin, pause for a moment, focus on where you are right now. Are you lying in bed in a dark room, letting the world slow down, or listening from a desk somewhere quiet while the rest of your home sleeps? What time is it where you are, late night, early morning, or somewhere in between? I like imagining you in that exact moment, choosing to travel into history with me. And if these slow, immersive documentaries help you unwind, think, or drift into sleep, consider subscribing. It tells me that someone out there values long-form storytelling that doesn't rush, and it keeps me inspired to create the next chapter for you. June 17th, 1936, Berlin. The detective's hand trembled slightly as he pinned the new insignia to his uniform. For 12 years, he had investigated murders, thefts, frauds, ordinary crimes committed by ordinary criminals. This morning, everything changed. The letter on his desk bore the seal of Reichsführer SS Heydrich Himmler, and its message was simple. His department no longer existed. The Kriminalpolizei, the criminal investigation police of Germany, had been absorbed into something new, something called the Sicherheitspolizei, the security police. He looked around the office at his colleagues, men who had spent careers building cases through evidence and interrogation, and saw the same confusion in their eyes. Outside his window, Berlin hummed with the mundane rhythms of a summer morning. Citizens walked to work, unaware that the men who once protected them from crime were being transformed into something entirely different. The architect of this transformation sat in an imposing building at Prinz-Albrecht-Straße 8, a grey stone structure that would become synonymous with terror. Heinrich Himmler had engineered a bureaucratic masterstroke by merging the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, or secret state, police with the Kriminalpolizei under a single administrative umbrella. He had created the largest plainclothes security apparatus in German history. The Sicherheitspolizei would eventually command 47,000 men, each one wearing the field grey uniform that distinguished them from the black-clad SS or the green-uniformed Ordnungspolizei. But the uniforms masked something more significant than organisational charts. Himmler had taken two fundamentally different institutions, one designed to suppress political opposition, the other to solve crimes and fuse them into a single weapon. The detective at his desk understood investigations, evidence, witnesses. He did not yet understand that his skills were about to be repurposed, not for justice, but for persecution. The creation of the SiPo represented the culmination of 3 years of Nazi consolidation of power. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Germany's police forces remained fragmented across regional states, each with its own command structure and jurisdiction. This frustrated the Nazi leadership, who viewed local police autonomy as an obstacle to total control. The Reichstag fire decree of February 28, 1933, had provided the legal foundation for what followed. Ostensibly a response to the burning of Germany's parliament building, the decree suspended civil liberties indefinitely. It introduced the concept of Schutzhaft protective custody, allowing police to arrest and detain individuals without charges, without trial, without time limits. What began as an emergency measure became permanent policy. By 1936, when Himmler formalised the Sicherheitspolizei structure, the legal architecture of the police state was already complete. But the SiPo was more than just police with expanded powers. It represented something unprecedented in modern policing: the complete fusion of criminal investigation with political, surveillance and ideological enforcement. The Kripo brought 32,000 experienced detectives, investigators, and forensic specialists. The Gestapo contributed 15,000 agents, trained in surveillance, interrogation, and counterintelligence. Together, they created an organisation that could track not just what people did, but what they thought, believed, and might do in the future. A Kripo detective who once gathered evidence to prove a suspect guilty would now compile dossiers on individuals who had committed no crime but belonged to the wrong political party, attended the wrong church, or came from the wrong ethnic background. The skills remained the same. The purpose had been inverted. The man Himmler chose to lead this apparatus understood its potential better than anyone. Reinhard Heydrich, just 32 years old in 1936, had been building the infrastructure for the SiPo since joining the Nazi Party 5 years earlier. Tall, blonde, and possessed of unusual intelligence. Heydrich had created an index card system that tracked hundreds of thousands of Germans deemed threats to the regime. His SD, the Sicherheitsdienst or security service, functioned as the Nazi Party's intelligence arm, monitoring everything from public opinion to church sermons to private conversations overheard in cafes. When Himmler made Heydrich chief of the Sicherheitspolizei, he granted him authority over both police and intelligence, enforcement and information. No one in Germany, perhaps no one in modern history, had ever wielded such concentrated power over civilian populations. Heydrich's vision for the SiPo was totalitarian in the purest sense, a security apparatus that penetrated every aspect of society, that anticipated crimes before they occurred, that eliminated threats before they manifested. The SiPo's structure reflected this all-encompassing ambition. At the top sat Heydrich and his immediate staff, coordinating operations across Germany, and, soon, across occupied Europe. Below them, regional commanders, called Inspekteur der Sicherheitspolizei, oversaw operations in major cities and districts. Each regional office combined Gestapo and Kripo departments under one roof, ensuring that political and criminal investigations could be coordinated instantly. The Gestapo focused on political enemies: communists, socialists, trade unionists, clergy who preached against the regime, intellectuals who wrote dissenting opinions, and anyone who violated the ever-expanding list of racial laws. The Kripo maintained its focus on conventional crime, but increasingly directed its resources toward people the regime defined as biologically dangerous: habitual criminals, homosexuals, Romani people, and those deemed asocial. Both branches could invoke Schutzhaft, that legally sanctioned kidnapping that sent people to concentration camps without trial or appeal. The detective pinning on his new insignia that June morning could not have imagined where this transformation would lead. Within 3 years, he might find himself not in Berlin, but in Vienna, Prague, or Warsaw, arriving in the wake of Wehrmacht tanks to seize police files and arrest political leaders. Within 5 years, he might be standing in a Polish forest, compiling lists of teachers, priests, and doctors to be executed. Within 6 years, he might be coordinating the deportation of thousands of people to places whose names he would learn to speak but never visit: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. The skills he had learned as a detective, systematic thinking, attention to detail, the ability to process large amounts of information would make him effective at these tasks. His career trajectory from criminal investigator to accomplice in genocide would not require him to become a monster. It would simply require him to do his job. Yet even in June 1936, warning signs existed for those willing to see them. The SiPo's founding coincided with a massive expansion of the concentration camp system. Dachau, established in 1933 as a temporary detention facility for political prisoners, had become permanent. Sachsenhausen opened near Berlin that summer, designed from the start as a model camp that could efficiently process thousands of inmates. The legal fiction of protective custody meant that the Gestapo could arrest anyone, and the existence of camps meant they had somewhere to send them. The Kripo's traditional role in the justice system, investigating crimes, gathering evidence for prosecution, became increasingly irrelevant as the SiPo gained the power to bypass courts entirely. Why build a case for trial when you could simply invoke protective custody? Why prove guilt when ideology defined entire categories of people as inherently dangerous? The SiPo also represented a profound shift in how the Nazi regime understood security. Traditional police forces react to crimes after they occur, gathering evidence and apprehending perpetrators. The Sicherheitspolizei was designed to prevent crimes by eliminating potential criminals before they could act. This required surveillance on an unprecedented scale. Every regional SiPo office maintained V-Männer, Vertrauensmänner, or informants who reported on their neighbours, colleagues, and even family members. A casual complaint about food rationing, overheard in a breadline and reported to the Gestapo, could result in arrest for defeatism. A worker who told a joke mocking Hitler might find himself denounced by a colleague and taken into custody for undermining public morale. The SiPo cultivated this atmosphere of mutual suspicion deliberately. When everyone might be watching, self-censorship became automatic. The most effective police state is one where citizens police themselves. By September 27th, 1939, when Heydrich announced the creation of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Security Main Office, or RSHA, the Sicherheitspolizei, had evolved again. The RSHA formalised the merger of the SiPo and SD, creating a super agency that combined police powers with intelligence gathering under one administrative roof. Heydrich now commanded not just Germany's security apparatus, but a blueprint for occupation. The organisation that began with a detective pinning on new insignia in a Berlin office had become the infrastructure for continental domination. The skills of criminal investigation, the techniques of political surveillance, the apparatus of detention and deportation all had been assembled and tested. As German troops invaded Poland that September, advance units of the Sicherheitspolizei followed immediately behind them. They carried lists. They knew who to arrest, where to find them, and what to do with them. The transformation was complete. The shadow police had emerged from the shadows, and Europe would never be the same. July 4th, 1931. Kiel, northern Germany. The naval officer stood at rigid attention as the court-martial board read its verdict. Lieutenant Zur, C. Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich, 27 years old, was being dishonourably discharged from the Reichsmarine for conduct unbecoming an officer. The specifics involved a broken engagement to a young woman whose father happened to be a well-connected naval officer. Heydrich had promised marriage, then abandoned her for another woman. In the rigid social world of Germany's naval officer corps, such behaviour was unforgivable. As he walked out of the hearing room in Kiel, his career in ruins, Heydrich carried with him a burning resentment that would shape the next 14 years of European history. He had been trained in intelligence work, in signals and communications, in the methodical collection and analysis of information. These skills would find a new employer. 6 months later, Heinrich Himmler hired him to build an intelligence service for the Nazi Party's growing SS organisation. The salary was pathetic, the work uncertain. Heydrich took it anyway. He had something to prove. What Heydrich built in the following 5 years remains one of history's most chilling examples of bureaucratic innovation in service of evil. He approached intelligence work the way an engineer approaches a complex machine, systematically, without sentiment, focused entirely on efficiency. His first task for Himmler was to create the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, as the Nazi Party's intelligence arm. Working from a tiny office with minimal staff, Heydrich began constructing index card files on everyone he deemed relevant to Nazi interests. Political opponents, yes, but also Jews, Catholics, Freemasons, homosexuals, intellectuals, foreign diplomats, even fellow Nazi Party members. Each card contained biographical information, political affiliations, known associates, and any detail that might prove useful for leverage or blackmail. By 1933, when Hitler came to power, Heydrich's filing system contained information on hundreds of thousands of Germans. By 1936, the system had expanded to track millions. This was surveillance at a scale never before attempted, and it predated computers by decades. The card index system reveals something essential about Heydrich's mentality. He believed information was power, and comprehensive information was absolute power. Where other Nazi leaders relied on intuition, ideology, or brute force, Heydrich relied on data. Before the SD arrested a communist organizer, they knew his meeting places, his associates, his family relationships, his finances, his mistresses. Before the Gestapo interrogated a suspect, they possessed detailed background information that allowed them to exploit weaknesses and verify lies. This informational advantage made Heydrich's organizations terrifyingly effective. A suspect brought in for questioning found that his interrogators already knew things about him that he thought were secret. The psychological impact was devastating. If they knew about your affair, your gambling debts, your illegal border crossing 3 years ago, what else did they know? Many suspects confessed to things they hadn't done simply because resistance seemed futile against an organisation that appeared omniscient. But Heydrich was more than just a master of information management. He possessed an intuitive understanding of organisational politics and bureaucratic empire building. When Himmler consolidated the Gestapo and Kripo into the Sicherheitspolizei in 1936, Heydrich manoeuvred himself into command of both the SiPo and the SD. This gave him control over political police, criminal police, and party intelligence, 3 separate power centres that he could now coordinate. Other Nazi leaders commanded larger organisations or more resources, but none could match the reach of Heydrich's surveillance and enforcement apparatus. He answered only to Himmler, who increasingly deferred to his brilliant subordinate's judgment. By 1939, when Heydrich created the RSHA to formally merge the SiPo and SD, he had become the most powerful security official in Germany, possibly in the world. He was 35 years old. Those who worked with Heydrich described a man of contradictions. Cultured yet brutal, intellectually brilliant yet emotionally stunted, capable of great charm and sudden cruelty. He was an accomplished violinist who could play Mozart with genuine feeling one evening and sign execution orders without hesitation the next morning. He flew his own plane, fenced competitively, and personally participated in military operations during the war, an unusual practice for someone of his bureaucratic rank. His physical appearance matched Nazi racial ideals: tall, blonde, athletic, the so-called Aryan archetype, yet he reportedly harbored anxiety about rumours of Jewish ancestry in his family background, rumours that were almost certainly false, but which may have driven his particularly fanatical commitment to Nazi racial ideology. His subordinates feared him. His colleagues distrusted him. Hitler himself called him the man with the iron heart, not as a compliment, but as a description of his perceived inhumanity. Heydrich's operational method became the template for Nazi occupation policy across Europe. He pioneered what would later be called the Heydrich system: rapid seizure of police and intelligence files, immediate arrest of political and intellectual leadership, establishment of local collaborator networks, and systematic use of terror to pacify populations. This system was first tested during the annexation of Austria in March 1938. While the world's attention focused on Wehrmacht troops marching into Vienna, Heydrich's advance teams moved with equal speed. Within hours of the Anschluss, SD and Gestapo officers had seized Austrian police headquarters, confiscated membership lists of political parties and Jewish organisations, and begun mass arrests. Within weeks, they had established a functioning SiPo apparatus that made Austria's absorption into the Reich administratively seamless. The Austrian test proved that Germany could not just conquer territory, but could efficiently suppress any opposition to that conquest. The methodology refined in Austria was deployed again in Czechoslovakia in March 1939. This time, Heydrich's teams moved even faster. They entered Prague before Czech government officials had fully evacuated, seizing intelligence files that would later be used to arrest resistance members throughout the occupation. Heydrich personally oversaw the establishment of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia's security apparatus, ensuring that German control extended not just over territory, but over every aspect of Czech public and private life. The occupation was brutal but efficient, a demonstration of totalitarian administration at its most effective. Heydrich had created a system that could be replicated anywhere. Take the capital, seize the files, arrest the leadership, establish informant networks, eliminate resistance. Each occupation provided lessons that improved the next one. Yet beneath Heydrich's cold efficiency lay a vision that extended beyond mere occupation management. Documents and testimony from those who worked closely with him suggest he envisioned the SiPo and SD as the permanent governing apparatus of a Nazi-dominated Europe. In his conception, traditional government ministries would handle routine administration, but the security services would exercise ultimate control through surveillance, detention powers, and the elimination of anyone who challenged Nazi ideology. This was not dictatorship through military rule, but through police power, more insidious, more penetrating, more permanent. The card index files would expand to cover entire populations. The network of informants would grow until no conversation was private, no dissent possible, Concentration camps would house not just political opponents but anyone deemed biologically or socially undesirable. This was Heydrich's vision, a police state so comprehensive that overt tyranny would become unnecessary because the population would police itself through fear. The man who built this system maintained a carefully cultivated public image. Photographs show him in SS uniform, his face sharp and aristocratic, every detail of his appearance immaculate. He projected absolute confidence and control. But people who knew him noted something unsettling in his eyes, a coldness that suggested an absence rather than a presence, as if some essential human quality had been excised or never existed. Perhaps this was the real horror of Reinhard Heydrich. Not that he was a monster, but that he was a highly intelligent, cultured, efficient bureaucrat who channeled those qualities toward monstrous ends. He didn't hate his victims in any personal sense. He categorized them, filed them, processed them. The question of their humanity simply didn't enter his calculations. By January 1942, when Heydrich convened the Wannsee Conference to coordinate the final solution, he had reached the apex of his power. He commanded security forces across occupied Europe, answered directly to Himmler and Hitler, and had been appointed acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, making him effectively the dictator of Czechoslovakia. His RSHA had become the administrative centre of genocide, coordinating Einsatzgruppen operations in the Soviet Union, managing deportations across Europe, and overseeing the construction of death camps. The young naval officer cashiered in disgrace 11 years earlier now held the power of life and death over millions. He had built the most sophisticated security apparatus in history. He had transformed police work from reactive law enforcement into proactive population control. He had created the infrastructure of the Holocaust, and he had done it all through systematic organization, meticulous documentation, and bureaucratic efficiency. The architect of terror had designed his masterpiece. Its blueprints were written in blood. March 12, 1938. 3:15 in the morning. The Austrian border. The SiPo advance team crossed into Austria while most of Europe slept. Their vehicles travelled without lights, following Wehrmacht units by 15 minutes close enough to benefit from military protection, far enough to maintain operational independence. In the back of each car sat lockboxes containing lists, names, addresses, organisational affiliations. These lists had been compiled over years by SD agents operating undercover in Austria, gathering intelligence in preparation for a day many Austrians hoped would never come. Now that day had arrived. The leader of the advance team, an SS Sturmbannführer with a doctoral degree in law, checked his watch. By dawn, they needed to be inside Vienna's police headquarters. By noon, they needed control of all police files, membership records of political parties, and the locations of key opposition figures. Speed was everything. The Wehrmacht would conquer Austria militarily. The SiPo would conquer it administratively. And administrative conquest, as Heydrich understood, was the only conquest that mattered. What followed in Austria over the next 72 hours established the template for every Nazi occupation that followed. As Wehrmacht tanks rolled through jubilant crowds, many Austrians genuinely welcomed the Anschluss. Heydrich's men moved through the shadows with surgical precision. They seized police headquarters in Vienna, Graz, Linz, and Salzburg, before local authorities even understood what was happening. In Vienna's police presidium on the Schottenring, SiPo officers walked directly to the archives and began boxing files. Austrian police officers who objected were arrested on the spot. By March 13th, the SiPo possessed complete records of every Austrian police investigation, every surveillance file on political activists, every intelligence report on opposition movements. They knew who had opposed the Nazis. They knew where these people lived. Within a week, 79,000 Austrians had been arrested. By summer, that number would exceed 150,000. The arrests followed a methodical pattern that revealed the SiPo's strategic thinking. First came political leaders. Socialists, communists, Christian Social Party officials who had supported Austrian independence. Then came intellectuals, university professors, journalists, lawyers, anyone whose education or platform gave them influence. Then came Jewish community leaders, rabbis, heads of Jewish organizations, wealthy businessmen. The SiPo didn't arrest randomly or from ideological frenzy. They worked from prioritized lists that targeted society's leadership. Infrastructure. Remove the leaders first, and the population becomes disorganized, unable to mount coherent resistance. This wasn't persecution as emotional catharsis. It was persecution as strategic demobilization. The Austrian experience taught the SiPo that you didn't need to arrest everyone to control everyone. You just needed to arrest the right people. But the Austrian operation also revealed something new and ominous: the emergence of systematic, bureaucratic anti-Semitism administered through police power. In Vienna, a young SS Hauptsturmführer named Adolf Eichmann established the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung, the Central Office for Jewish Emigration. The name was deliberately misleading. Eichmann's office created an assembly line system for dispossessing and expelling Austrian Jews. A Jewish family would enter the building and be processed through multiple stations: property confiscation, passport cancellation, emigration permit issuance, all in one continuous flow. By the time they left, they had been stripped of everything they owned and were permitted to leave Austria with virtually nothing. Eichmann later described this system with bureaucratic pride as efficient and modern. He had industrialized ethnic cleansing, reducing a complex process of persecution to a standardized procedure that could be measured in processing times and throughput rates. The success of the Austrian operation convinced Heydrich that the SiPo model could be exported anywhere. When Germany occupied the Sudetenland in October 1938 following the Munich Agreement, SiPo teams accompanied Wehrmacht units immediately. When Germany seized the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, violating that same agreement, the SiPo arrived in Prague within hours. This time they moved even more quickly than in Vienna. Czech President Emil Hácha was still meeting with Hitler in Berlin when Heydrich's men walked into Prague Castle and the headquarters of Czech intelligence. They seized files before Czech officials could destroy them. They occupied police headquarters before local forces could organize resistance. They arrested key resistance figures before underground networks could react. The speed of the security takeover actually exceeded the speed of the military occupation. In Prague, the SiPo demonstrated another evolving capability: the use of seized intelligence to preemptively destroy resistance movements before they could form. Czech intelligence files contained information about potential resistance members, military officers opposed to occupation, and intellectuals who might organize opposition. The SiPo used this information immediately. Within a week of occupation, they had arrested hundreds of people who had not yet committed any act of resistance, but whom Czech intelligence had identified as potential threats. This represented a new level of preventive security, arresting people not for what they had done or were doing, but for what they might do based on intelligence analysis. Traditional police forces react to crime. The SiPo sought to prevent crime by eliminating potential criminals. This logic, taken to its extreme, justified almost unlimited detention power. The occupation of Czechoslovakia also revealed tensions between the SiPo and Wehrmacht that would persist throughout the war. Some German military officers objected to SiPo methods, considering them dishonorable and counterproductive. General Johannes Blaskowitz, who commanded troops in both Austria and Czechoslovakia, filed reports complaining that SiPo brutality was creating unnecessary resistance and damaging Germany's international reputation. His concerns were dismissed. Heydrich argued that Wehrmacht's squeamishness demonstrated a failure to understand modern occupation. The goal wasn't to win hearts and minds, but to establish control so complete that opposition became impossible. Military force conquered territory. Police power pacified populations. The Wehrmacht should concern itself with the former and leave the latter to professionals. This attitude created lasting resentment between military and security services, but it also clarified their respective roles in Hitler's expanding empire. The Czech experience also introduced what would become a hallmark of SiPo operations: the strategic use of collaborative relationships with local police forces. Rather than replace Czech police entirely, the SiPo subordinated them. Czech officers continued to patrol streets, investigate crimes, maintain order, but now they reported to German SiPo supervisors who controlled all important decisions. This approach conserved German manpower while ensuring control A Czech police officer might arrest a fellow Czech for black market activity, but the SiPo decided whether that person went to Czech court or German concentration camp. Local police became instruments of occupation while maintaining the appearance of local administration. This technique of indirect control through institutional capture would be refined and deployed across occupied Europe. By the end of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the SiPo had transformed from a domestic security service into an occupation apparatus. The lessons from Austria and Czechoslovakia were clear: move fast, seize files, arrest leaders, establish local collaborators, use existing institutions wherever possible. These methods had been tested and refined. The organizational structures had been established, the personnel had been trained, the bureaucratic procedures had been standardized. What happened in Vienna and Prague were beta tests, proof of concept demonstrations. Poland would be the full-scale deployment. But there was a crucial difference. Austria and Czechoslovakia were rehearsals for occupation. Poland would be a rehearsal for something far worse. The SiPo had proven they could conquer and control. Now they would prove they could do something that no police force in modern history had attempted: the systematic decapitation of entire societies through targeted mass murder. The young detective who had crossed into Austria in the early morning hours of March 12th returned to Berlin 3 months later with a promotion and a new understanding of his organization's purpose. He had watched the Anschluss with his own eyes. He had participated in mass arrests. He had seen how quickly a modern society could be subdued when its security apparatus was seized and its leadership eliminated. He had witnessed Eichmann's assembly line expulsion system and understood that persecution could be rationalized, systematized, made efficient. If he felt any moral qualms about this work, he kept them to himself. In the Sicherheitspolizei, expressions of doubt were career-ending at best, life-threatening at worst. Besides, he told himself these were legal operations. They followed proper procedures. Every arrest was documented. Every property confiscation was recorded. The system maintained meticulous records. That alone proved it was legitimate, didn't it? The answer to that question would become clear soon enough. In forests and ravines across Poland and the Soviet Union, where record-keeping continued even as the nature of the crimes being recorded crossed every threshold of human decency. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 a.m. The Polish border. The Einsatzgruppen crossed into Poland 30 minutes after the Wehrmacht's artillery barrage began. 7 motorized units, 2,700 men total, rolled across the frontier following military units like shadows following substance. They wore field grey uniforms that from a distance resembled Wehrmacht attire, but closer inspection revealed SD insignia and Sicherheitspolizei markings. In their vehicles they carried something more lethal than weapons: the Sonderfahndungsbuch Polen, the Special Prosecution Book for Poland. This document, compiled over months by Heydrich's staff, contained 61,000 names: Polish nobles, Catholic priests, university professors, lawyers, journalists, politicians, business owners, anyone who represented Polish leadership, Polish culture, Polish identity. The book was organized geographically, making it easy for each Einsatzgruppe to locate targets in their assigned region. Within weeks, most of the people listed in that book would be dead. Their crime was not opposition to German rule. The invasion had just begun. Resistance hadn't formed. Their crime was potential opposition, potential leadership, potential Polish identity that might inspire others. What happened next shocked even some Nazi officials. The Einsatzgruppen didn't wait for resistance to emerge or for underground movements to organize. They began killing immediately, systematically, from lists. On September 7th, less than a week after invasion, the intelligence action, the operation against the intelligentsia, commenced. In Bydgoszcz, German forces and local ethnic Germans identified prominent Poles from pre-compiled lists. That night, execution squads shot hundreds of teachers, priests, and professionals in the Fordon Valley. In Krakow, SiPo officers arrived at Jagiellonian University with a request. Would the professors attend a lecture on German educational policy? 183 professors and academic staff arrived at the appointed time. They were arrested immediately and sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Many would die there. The university? founded in 1364 and one of Europe's oldest, was effectively decapitated in a single operation. The scale of the killing accelerated through autumn 1939. In forests, ravines, and abandoned forts across Poland, Einsatzgruppen conducted mass executions of civilians who had never raised a hand against German forces. At Palmary, in the forest outside Warsaw, over 1,700 Poles were murdered between December 1939 and July 1940. The victims included intellectuals, priests, scouts, athletes, politicians, anyone who might inspire Polish resistance or preserve Polish culture. The shootings followed a routine pattern. Victims were transported in covered trucks so they couldn't identify the execution site. They were forced to dig their own graves, though often the Germans prepared mass graves in advance for efficiency. They were shot in groups, usually in the neck, falling into the pit. The next group would be forced to arrange the bodies before adding themselves to the pile. It was systematic, it was bureaucratic, and it was the SiPo's deliberate policy. The Wehrmacht's response to these massacres revealed a critical tension that would define the German occupation. General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding the 8th Army in Poland, compiled detailed reports on SiPo atrocities. His letter to Wehrmacht Commander-in-Chief Walther von Brauchitsch on November 27th was explicit. The acts of violence carried out against Jews, Poles and others which have taken place in broad daylight attract attention and arouse indignation wherever they have been observed. He warned that such actions were corrupting German troops who witnessed them, creating a regime of moral nihilism. Blaskowitz called for SiPo operations to be placed under military jurisdiction. His complaints reached Hitler, who dismissed them contemptuously. The Wehrmacht would conquer Poland militarily. The SiPo would reshape Poland demographically and culturally. That division of responsibility was not negotiable. Heydrich's September 27, 1939 conference at RSHA headquarters in Berlin codified this approach. He gathered senior SiPo and SD commanders and outlined the long-term plan for occupied Poland. The goal was not mere military occupation but ethnic restructuring. Poland's educated classes would be eliminated. Its Jewish population would be concentrated in ghettos. Its territory would be divided. Western regions would be annexed directly to Germany and ethnically cleansed of Poles. Central regions would become the general government, a colonial territory where Poles existed only as uneducated labourers. This required the systematic elimination of everyone who might preserve Polish national consciousness. Hence the intelligence action. Hence the targeting of priests, teachers, and professionals. Hence the focus on executing people not for what they had done, but for who they were. The Einsatzgruppen's composition revealed how the SiPo had evolved from a police force into something unprecedented. These units combined Gestapo officers, Kripo detectives, SD intelligence agents, Orpo order police, battalions, and Waffen SS units. Some members were career policemen with decades of experience in criminal investigation. Others were young SS ideologues. Some had university degrees in law or criminology. Others were barely literate. What united them was their willingness to participate in mass murder justified by ideology. Post-war testimony revealed diverse motivations. Some believed Nazi racial theories, some were advancing their careers, some convinced themselves they were following legitimate orders. Some discovered they enjoyed killing. The SiPo provided organisational structure, logistical support, and bureaucratic justification. The individual members provided the willingness to pull triggers. The documentation of these killings demonstrated the SiPo's obsessive bureaucratic culture. Einsatzgruppen filed regular reports with RSHA headquarters in Berlin, detailing their operations with statistical precision. A typical report might note, Einsatzkommando 4 conducted a security operation in Sector 8. Executions, 137 males, 42 females. Categories, 63 intelligentsia, 47 former military officers, 32 political functionaries, 23 clergy, 14 others. These reports were typed in triplicate, filed by date and unit, and stored in RSHA archives. The SiPo was murdering Polish society while maintaining perfect paperwork. This wasn't savage violence. It was administrative violence. carried out with the same methodical attention to documentation that characterized every other aspect of German bureaucracy. The horror lay precisely in that they kept records because they saw nothing wrong with what they were doing. By the end of 1939, the SiPo had executed approximately 60,000 Polish intellectuals, clergy, and leaders. Another 100,000 had been arrested and sent to concentration camps. By the end of the occupation, those numbers would multiply many times over. But the initial slaughter served its purpose. It decapitated Polish society, eliminating the educated class that might have organised sustained resistance. It also accomplished something else. It normalised mass murder within the Sicherheitspolizei. Officers who might have balked at killing civilians learned that such operations were not just permitted but expected. They learned that meticulous documentation protected them from military interference. They learned that killing designated categories of people was considered legitimate security work. Poland was where the SiPo crossed the threshold from security service to death squads. The skills developed in criminal investigation and political surveillance were now applied to categorizing people for execution. The Polish operation also established bureaucratic euphemisms that would characterize Nazi killing throughout the war. People weren't murdered. They were subjected to Sonderbehandlung, special treatment. Massacres weren't crimes. They were Sicherheitsmaßnahmen, security measures. Victims weren't innocents. They were Banditen or Volkstumsgefährliche Elemente bandits, or ethnically dangerous elements. This language served a purpose beyond mere obfuscation. It created psychological distance between perpetrators and their actions. A police officer might struggle to justify shooting a teacher, but if that teacher was categorized as an intelligentsia target, a potential resistance leader, a Volkstumsgefährliche element, the shooting became a procedural matter, an administrative decision, a security necessity. The euphemisms transformed murder into bureaucratic routine. The nightmare of Poland in autumn 1939 was that it combined the ancient brutality of conquest with modern administrative efficiency. Conquerors throughout history had slaughtered defeated populations. What made the SiPo different was systematic premeditation. They didn't kill in the heat of battle or in retaliation for resistance. They killed from lists compiled before invasion began. They killed according to carefully planned schedules and procedures. They killed with the same organisational efficiency that German industry applied to, manufacturing automobiles or chemicals. This was industrialised violence against civilians, and it was directed by a police organisation that continued to think of itself as a legitimate security service. The detective who had crossed the Polish border on September 1st, 1939, would have recognised some of his work in the intelligence gathering and list compilation. What he might not have recognised, what perhaps no traditional policeman could have recognised, was what happened when police powers were unleashed without legal constraints, moral limits, or democratic oversight. Poland showed what police could become when transformed from law enforcement into instruments of ideological genocide, and the world would soon learn that Poland was just the beginning. December 15th, 1939, Krakow, occupied Poland. The SiPo headquarters at Pomorska Street looked unremarkable from outside. A solid stone building in Krakow's commercial district. The kind of structure that might house insurance officers or government administrators. Inside, it had become the nerve centre of terror for southern Poland. In room after room, clerks typed identity cards, filed denunciation letters, updated registry databases, and maintained what would become the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus ever imposed on a occupied population. By the end of 1940, these offices would contain files on millions of Poles and Jews. Their addresses, occupations, family relationships, political affiliations, movements between districts. The SiPo had transformed occupation from military control into administrative penetration. Every resident of the general government would exist in their files before they existed anywhere else. The card catalogue had become more powerful than the gun. The general government itself was an administrative innovation designed to exploit Poland without annexing it. Germany directly absorbed Western Poland into the Reich, expelling Polish inhabitants and replacing them with ethnic German settlers. But central Poland posed a problem. Too large to easily incorporate, too populated to quickly cleanse, too economically valuable to simply devastate. The solution was to create a colonial territory called the General Government, ruled by Hans Frank as Hitler's personal representative, but policed by Heydrich's SiPo. This division of authority created constant tension. Frank wanted to extract economic value from Polish labour, while the SiPo pursued ideological goals that often disrupted production. But on one point, they agreed. The SiPo's security apparatus was necessary to prevent Polish resistance from organising. The Kenkarty system exemplified how the SiPo used documentation as a control mechanism. Beginning in early 1940, every Polish resident over 15 years old was required to register for an identity card that contained their photograph, fingerprints, occupation, and residence. The cards were coded by ethnicity. Germans received one type, ethnic Germans another, Poles a third, Jews a fourth. Without the proper Kenkarte, a person couldn't receive a ration card for food, couldn't get a work permit, couldn't move between districts. The card system made existence itself dependent on SiPo registration. And registration meant revealing everything about yourself to the authorities who could deport you to a concentration camp without trial. But the Kenkarte was just the visible surface of a much deeper surveillance infrastructure. Behind it lay the Judenkarte, the Jewish card index, which tracked every Jewish resident with detailed information about property ownership, family trees, occupational skills, and residential locations. SiPo clerks updated this database constantly as Jews were forced into ghettos, as property was confiscated, as individuals died or were deported. The database allowed the SiPo to locate any Jewish person in their jurisdiction within minutes. It also allowed them to quantify Jewish population with precision. 300,000 Jews in Warsaw, 70,000 in Łódź, 68,000 in Krakow. These weren't estimates, they were exact counts derived from mandatory registration. The Nazis would use these numbers to plan deportations with the precision of industrial logistics. The administrative apparatus extended into every aspect of occupied life through a proliferation of permits, registrations, and documentation requirements. Want to change residence? Apply to the SiPo for a Wohnungsausweis, a residence permit. Want to work? Apply for an Arbeitskarte, processed and issued by SiPo-controlled labour offices. Want food? Collect a Lebensmittelkarte ration card, distributed based on ethnicity as determined by SiPo classifications. The bureaucratic requirements served multiple purposes. They generated information that fed the surveillance apparatus. They created opportunities for corruption that could be exploited to recruit informants. And they made daily life so exhausting and complicated that people had little energy left for resistance. The SiPo had discovered that the administrative burden could be as effective a control mechanism as violence. The system relied heavily on collaboration, and the SiPo cultivated informants systematically. By 1941, an estimated 15,000 Poles worked as paid informants for the SiPo in the general government. Some were motivated by ideology, ethnic Germans who had lived in Poland before the war, anti-Semites, extreme nationalists. Others were motivated by survival desperate people who traded information for food rations or protection for family members. Still others were motivated by personal grudges, using the occupation to settle scores with neighbours, rivals, or competitors. The SiPo processed hundreds of denunciation letters weekly, neighbour informing on neighbour for illegal food storage, business rivals reporting each other for black market activity, family members denouncing relatives for anti-German statements. The occupation created an economy of betrayal, and the SiPo banked the profits. Technology played an unexpected role in this administrative empire. IBM's German subsidiary provided Hollerith punch card machines that allowed the SiPo to process information at unprecedented speed. Each Kenkarte, each registration, each arrest generated data that could be converted to punch cards and mechanically sorted. Want to find all Jewish males aged 18 to 40 in Krakow? The machines could generate that list in hours. Want to identify all Polish residents who had moved between districts without proper permits? The system could flag them automatically. This wasn't the digital surveillance of the 21st century, but it was far more sophisticated than manual filing systems. The SiPo was applying cutting-edge information technology to the systematic oppression of millions of people. The terror apparatus in the general government also included a network of detention facilities that made concentration camps like Auschwitz just one part of a larger system. Every major city had SiPo-controlled prisons where suspects could be held indefinitely. Krakow's Montelupich prison, taken over by the SiPo in September 1939, held thousands of Poles awaiting interrogation, trial, or deportation to concentration camps. The Pawiak prison in Warsaw served similar purposes. These facilities existed in a legal grey zone, not part of the regular criminal justice system, not officially concentration camps, but places where the SiPo could hold people while deciding their fate. Many prisoners were released after weeks or months of detention without ever being charged with a crime. Others disappeared into the concentration camp system. The uncertainty itself served as punishment. The Action Außerordentliche Befriedungsaktion, or Extraordinary Pacification Action of Spring 1940, demonstrated how the SiPo used its accumulated intelligence for mass violence. Hans Frank requested that the SiPo eliminate potential resistance leaders before they could organise. Using their registries and intelligence files, the SiPo compiled lists of approximately 6,500 Poles targeted for execution: teachers, priests, former military officers, landowners, activists. In May and June 1940, SiPo and SD units worked through these lists systematically, arresting people and executing them without trial. The victims had committed no acts of resistance. Many didn't even know they were on lists, but SiPo intelligence identified them as potential leaders. The operation aimed not to punish past actions, but to prevent future resistance by eliminating anyone who might organise it. By the end of 1940, the SiPo had transformed the general government into a laboratory for totalitarian administrative control. They had proven that a relatively small security force, 2,500 permanent SiPo personnel, could control a population of 12 million through systematic registration, surveillance informant networks, and selective terror. They had shown that modern information management technology could dramatically enhance police effectiveness. They had demonstrated that most people would comply with oppression if the administrative requirements were made sufficiently complex and the penalties for non-compliance sufficiently severe. These lessons would be applied across occupied Europe. But the general government remained the most thorough example of SiPo methodology, the complete penetration of society by security services, until public life and private life both existed under constant surveillance. The empire of files had proven more durable than any empire built by conquest alone. May 15th, 1940, Brussels, Belgium. The SiPo advance team arrived in Brussels a week after Wehrmacht tanks had rolled through the city's Art Nouveau boulevards. They made no dramatic entrance, no public announcement of their presence. Instead, they quietly established offices in requisition buildings and began the methodical work that had become their signature: seizing police files, identifying political opponents, establishing surveillance networks. But something was different this time. The SiPo officers, who had operated in Poland with brutal efficiency, now received explicit instructions to proceed carefully. Belgium was not Poland. France was not Poland. Western Europe required a different approach. Not because Nazi ideology viewed Western Europeans as equals, it didn't, but because political calculation demanded restraint. These were industrialized, economically valuable territories whose populations Germany hoped to integrate into the Reich's economic system. Mass terror would be counterproductive. The SiPo would be selective, surgical, almost invisible compared to their operations in the East. The contrast was deliberate and revealing. In Poland, the SiPo had executed 60,000 people in the first 3 months of occupation. In Belgium and the Netherlands, combined, over the same period, they executed fewer than 200. In Poland, they had targeted entire categories of people, all university professors, all Catholic priests, all Jewish community leaders. In Western Europe, they focused on specific individuals, communist organisers, resistance leaders, intelligence assets who might aid the Allies. The SiPo's operations in the West demonstrated that Nazi brutality was not mindless savagery but calculated policy. When ideology demanded extermination, they exterminated. When pragmatism demanded restraint, they showed restraint. This flexibility made them more dangerous, not less, because it proved they understood exactly what they were doing. The occupation of France illustrated this calibrated approach at its most sophisticated. When Wehrmacht forces reached Paris on June 14, 1940, SiPo advance units followed within days but waited before conducting mass operations. They observed, studied, mapped the French political landscape. Only after understanding the local power structures did they begin arrests, and those arrests followed a hierarchy of priority. First came foreign nationals who might serve as Allied intelligence assets, Polish expatriates, Czech refugees, German communists who had fled to France in the 1930s. Then came French Communist Party leadership, seen as the most dangerous political opposition. Only much later did they target French resistance members, because in summer 1940, French resistance barely existed. The SiPo's patience demonstrated strategic sophistication. They let the situation develop before responding to it. The appointment of Karl Oberg as Höherer SS Polizeiführer, Higher SS, and police leader for occupied France in May 1942 brought increased SiPo pressure, but still nothing approaching the Polish model. Oberg commanded approximately 3,500 SiPo and SD personnel in France, a force that seemed substantial until compared to Poland's numbers relative to population. France had 40 million people and 3,500 SiPo officers. The general government had 12 million people and 2,500 officers plus extensive auxiliary forces. The ratio revealed the different approach. In France, the SiPo relied more heavily on French collaboration, particularly after the establishment of the Vichy regime. Philippe Pétain's government handled most internal security operations, arrested communists and resistance members, enforced anti-Jewish legislation. The SiPo supervised and directed but let French authorities do much of the actual police work. This collaborative model appeared in its most disturbing form in anti-Jewish persecution. In Poland, SiPo officers directly organized roundups, forced Jews into ghettos, supervised deportations. In France, they often worked through French police. The Velodrome de Hiver roundup of July 16 and 17, 1942 demonstrated this method horrifyingly. The SiPo ordered the arrest of foreign and stateless Jews in Paris, 13,000 people total. But French police conducted the actual roundup, going door to door, dragging families from apartments, transporting them to the Velodrome where they were held, in appalling conditions before deportation. The SiPo supervised verified arrests against their lists, managed transportation to transit camps. But the visible face of persecution was French, allowing the Germans to maintain political distance while still achieving their objectives. Yet restraint in Western Europe had clear limits, defined by the Nacht- und Nebel, Night and Fog Decree of December 7, 1941. This order, personally signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel but implemented by the SiPo, established that resistance members in Western Europe would disappear without trace. No trials, no notifications to families, no information about their fate. They would vanish into night and fog, the uncertainty serving as a terror weapon against potential resistance. The SiPo arrested thousands under this decree, transporting them to concentration camps in Germany where many died. The Night and Fog program revealed that even in Western Europe, where the SiPo showed relative restraint, they remained fundamentally an instrument of terror, willing to operate outside all legal norms when they deemed it necessary. The hostage policy illustrated another dimension of calibrated brutality. When resistance members killed German soldiers or officials, the SiPo responded with executions of hostages, but the ratios varied significantly by location. In Poland, the SiPo executed 100 or more civilians for each German death. In the Soviet Union, similar or higher ratios applied. In France, the official ratio was 50 hostages per German killed, though actual ratios varied. In Belgium and the Netherlands, ratios were generally lower. These differences weren't arbitrary. They reflected calculated judgments about how much terror each population could endure, before collaboration collapsed and resistance became universal. The SiPo had learned that terror was most effective when precisely calibrated to local conditions. The economic dimension of occupation in Western Europe also shaped SiPo operations. France possessed industrial capacity Germany needed. Its factories produced weapons, vehicles, textiles for the Wehrmacht. Its agriculture fed German soldiers and workers. Its rail system transported supplies to the Eastern Front. Excessive SiPo terror might disrupt this economic exploitation. When the SiPo arrested French factory workers for resistance activities, German economic administrators sometimes objected that these arrests were interrupting production. The SiPo usually prevailed in these disputes. Security always trumped economics in Nazi ideology, but the disputes themselves revealed an awareness of trade-offs that didn't exist in Eastern Europe, where economic destruction was often a deliberate policy goal. The experience of Western European Jews highlighted the regional variations in SiPo policy with tragic clarity. In Poland, 90% of the pre-war Jewish population was murdered, most killed near their homes or deported to death camps in occupied Poland. In France, approximately 25% of the Jewish population was murdered, and most deportations occurred only in 1942 through 1944, years after the Polish killing had begun. In the Netherlands, 75% were murdered. In Belgium, 40%. In Denmark, fewer than 2%, largely because the Danish underground organised a mass evacuation to Sweden when deportations began. These statistics reflected local conditions, geography, resistance, effectiveness, collaboration levels, but they also reflected SiPo choices about when to prioritise anti-Jewish operations versus other security goals. The story of Hans Kallmayr illustrated how individual SiPo personnel could exercise surprising latitude within the system. Kallmayr, a German lawyer working in the SiPo apparatus in the occupied Netherlands, was responsible for ruling on petitions from people claiming they were incorrectly classified as Jewish. He should have been a functionary rubber-stamping denials. Instead, he approved thousands of applications on dubious grounds, accepting implausible genealogical evidence, overlooking inconsistencies in documents. Each approval meant that person avoided deportation. After the war, investigators concluded Kallmayr had knowingly falsified decisions to save lives. He worked within the SiPo system while subverting it, proof that the apparatus contained individuals who retained moral agency and used it courageously. But Kallmayr's story also underscored how rare such resistance was. Thousands of SiPo officers worked in Western Europe. One deliberately saved lives. By 1944, as Allied invasion loomed and resistance intensified, the distinction between Eastern and Western occupation began to collapse. The SiPo in France arrested approximately 70,000 resistance members and hostages between 1940 and 1944. They executed approximately 30,000 French civilians. They deported 75,000 Jews, of whom only 3% survived. The numbers were horrific, representing immense suffering and loss. But they remained proportionally lower than Eastern Europe's catastrophic numbers. This difference was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate SiPo strategy. In the East, annihilation. In the West, exploitation with selective terror. The strategy demonstrated that the Sicherheitspolizei was not a blunt instrument of violence, but a flexible apparatus of oppression that adapted its methods to political, economic, and strategic circumstances. That adaptability made it more effective and, ultimately, more deadly. A machine that kills everyone eventually exhausts itself. A machine that kills selectively can continue indefinitely. The SiPo understood this distinction, and Western Europe paid for that understanding with tens of thousands of lives. June 22nd, 1941, 4 a.m. The Soviet border. 3,000 men crossed into the Soviet Union in the first hours of Operation Barbarossa, moving in the wake of 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers, but operating under separate command. These were the Einsatzgruppen action groups, organised into 4 main units, designated A, B, C, and D. Each Einsatzgruppe subdivided into smaller Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos, mobile teams of 75 to 200 men equipped with trucks, radios, and weapons. Their official mission was security, eliminating Soviet commissars, destroying Communist Party infrastructure, preventing sabotage. Their actual mission was far darker. Orders issued before the invasion designated all Jews in occupied Soviet territory as security threats to be eliminated. The Einsatzgruppen would transform the Sicherheitspolizei from an organisation that committed atrocities into an organisation that existed primarily to commit atrocities. What began on that June morning would leave over 1.5 million people dead by war's end. The composition of these units revealed the breadth of German society's complicity in what followed. Einsatzgruppen commanders were typically educated men: lawyers, economists, a physician, a Protestant minister, even an opera singer. Most held doctoral degrees. These were not society's outcasts, but its achievers. Below them served a mixture of SiPo officers, SD intelligence agents, Waffen SS soldiers, order police battalions, and administrative personnel. Approximately 35% came from the SiPo itself, career policemen who had investigated crimes in German cities and now were tasked with mass murder in conquered territories. Another 35% came from the Ordnungspolizei, the regular uniformed police. 15% came from the Waffen SS. The remainder included translators, drivers, and local auxiliaries recruited from Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Latvian populations. This mixing of SS ideologues with career policemen was deliberate. The policemen provided organisational expertise and investigative skills. The SS provided ideological commitment and brutality. The first killings began within days of the invasion, but they escalated rapidly as commanders tested the boundaries of their orders. Initially, Einsatzgruppen focused on Jewish men of military age, justified as potential partisans or communist sympathisers. But by August 1941, they were murdering entire communities: men, women, children, elderly. The transition from selective killing to total extermination happened so quickly that it suggests either extremely permissive initial orders or rapid feedback from Berlin encouraging escalation. Evidence points to both. Heydrich's pre-invasion instructions contained deliberately vague language about eliminating Jews in party and state positions that subordinates could interpret broadly. And when reports of escalating violence reached Berlin, neither Heydrich nor Himmler ordered restraint, they ordered continuation. Babi Yar remains the most infamous example of Einsatzgruppen methodology at industrial scale. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, Einsatzgruppe C, working with SiPo and order police reinforcements, murdered 33,771 Jews from Kiev in a ravine on the city's outskirts. The operation required meticulous planning. Notices ordered Kiev's Jewish population to assemble for resettlement, a deception that ensured victims arrived voluntarily, with belongings. They were marched to the ravine, forced to undress, led to the edge in groups, and shot. The killing continued for 2 days without pause. German soldiers took breaks for meals and cigarettes between shooting sessions. The bureaucratic precision of the operation victim counts kept to the individual, ammunition expenditures recorded, belongings catalogued demonstrated that this was not spontaneous violence but administered death. The psychological toll on perpetrators became apparent relatively quickly, though not in the way one might hope. Some Einsatzgruppen members suffered breakdowns, turned to alcohol, requested transfers, but most adapted, and several mechanisms facilitated that adaptation. Physical distance helped. Commanders directed operations, but often didn't pull triggers themselves. Ideological indoctrination provided justification. Victims were portrayed as existential threats to Germany. Bureaucratic language created emotional distance. They weren't. Murdering children but processing security threats. Peer pressure discouraged dissent. Objecting to orders marked one as weak or politically unreliable. And the sheer scale of killing created a psychological point of no return. After participating in murdering hundreds, what did hundreds more matter? Himmler's visit to observe an execution in Minsk in August 1941 became notorious because it hinted at leadership's awareness that mass shootings were unsustainable. According to witnesses, Himmler watched an Einsatzgruppe shoot approximately 100 people, became visibly distressed when blood and brain matter splattered near him, and afterward told the unit commander to find more humane methods. More humane for whom? Not for the victims, who would still die. For the perpetrators, whose psychological well-being concerned Nazi leadership because psychological breakdown reduced killing efficiency. This concern led directly to the development of gas vans in late 1941. Mobile chambers where carbon monoxide from vehicle exhaust killed victims enclosed inside. Gas vans were more efficient, less visible, and spared German personnel the trauma of face-to-face killing. The Jaeger report provided the most chilling documentation of Einsatzgruppen operations. Karl Jaeger, commander of Einsatzkommando 3 operating in Lithuania, compiled a detailed accounting of his unit's activities from July 2nd to December 1st, 1941. The document listed 137 operations, each entry noting the date, location, and number killed, broken down by category. August 28th, Rokiskis, 3,208 Jews, 3 Jews, 5 Jews, men, women, and children, categorized separately as if accounting for different types of inventory. The total, 137,346 people. Jaeger concluded his report with bureaucratic satisfaction. I can confirm today that Einsatzkommando 3 has achieved the goal of solving the Jewish problem in Lithuania. There are no more Jews in Lithuania, apart from work Jews and their families. He had exterminated an entire population and documented it with accountant's precision. The role of Wehrmacht cooperation in these massacres remained controversial for decades after the war, but is now historically established. While the Einsatzgruppen operated under separate command, they depended on Wehrmacht for logistics, fuel, ammunition, transportation, communications equipment, access to military-controlled areas. In many cases, Wehrmacht units provided security for Einsatzgruppen operations, cordoning off execution sites, guarding columns of victims being marched to killing grounds. Some Wehrmacht soldiers photographed massacres. Hundreds of such photographs survived the war. Some units went further, conducting their own killings of Jewish civilians in cooperation with Einsatzgruppen. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht that only fought an honourable military campaign while the SS conducted atrocities collapsed under documentary evidence showing extensive military complicity. Local collaboration proved essential to the Einsatzgruppen's reach and effectiveness. The units themselves numbered only 3,000 Germans initially, far too few to police vast occupied Soviet territories or locate and round up dispersed Jewish populations. They recruited heavily from local populations, particularly in Ukraine, Lithuania, and Latvia, where pre-existing anti-Semitism and anti-communism created willing collaborators. These auxiliary units participated directly in massacres, often with enthusiasm that shocked even German commanders. In Lithuania, the RSHA's commando alone murdered approximately 26,000 Jews under German direction. In Ukraine, auxiliary police battalions participated in hundreds of mass shooting operations. These collaborators provided local knowledge which families were Jewish, where people might be hiding, that made systematic extermination possible. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered approximately 500,000 people, nearly all Jews. By war's end, that number exceeded 1.5 million. These killings represented approximately 1/3 of all Holocaust victims, making the Einsatzgruppen campaign comparable in death toll to all 6 extermination camps combined. Yet the Einsatzgruppen remained less known in popular consciousness than Auschwitz or Treblinka, perhaps because their method shooting seemed primitive compared to the industrial technology of gas chambers, perhaps because their crimes occurred in remote eastern forests rather than purpose-built facilities. But the Einsatzgruppen represented something arguably more disturbing than death camps. Ordinary police units transformed, through ideology and circumstance, into mobile killing squads that murdered civilians with handguns and rifles, face to face, victim by victim, day after day, for months. The Einsatzgruppen also served as the proving ground for what would become the final solution. The systematic murder of Soviet Jews demonstrated that it was operationally possible to kill entire populations, but it also revealed problems. The psychological toll on shooters, the visibility of mass shooting operations, the logistical inefficiency of bringing executioners to victims. These observations led directly to the development of extermination camps, where gas chambers would make killing more efficient and less psychologically taxing for perpetrators. The Einsatzgruppen were the pilot program, the death camps were the scale-up. Without the lessons learned by the SiPo in Soviet forests and ravines, the Holocaust might have unfolded differently, perhaps not at all, perhaps merely more slowly. The men who crossed the Soviet border on June 22nd, 1941, many of them career policemen who had joined the force to enforce traffic laws and investigate burglaries, had become the advance guard of genocide. The transformation was complete. October 15th, 1941, occupied Belarus. The Wehrmacht supply convoy never saw the ambush. Soviet partisans, operating from forest hideouts, detonated explosives beneath the lead truck, then raked the column with machine gun fire before melting back into the woodland. 23 German soldiers died. The partisan unit suffered no casualties. For the Wehrmacht, it was a tactical setback, one of hundreds along overextended supply lines. For the Sicherheitspolizei, it was justification for something they'd been planning since occupation began: total war against civilian populations in partisan zones. The SiPo's anti-partisan doctrine, formalized under the euphemism Bandenbekämpfung, anti-bandit operations, would transform entire regions of occupied Soviet territory into free fire zones where villages were burned, populations deported or executed. And the distinction between partisan fighter and innocent civilian was deliberately erased. In the name of security, the SiPo would kill hundreds of thousands. The anti-partisan campaign revealed the SiPo's fundamental philosophy: preventive elimination. Traditional military doctrine held that counterinsurgency should isolate guerrillas from civilian populations through winning hearts and minds, providing security, demonstrating good governance, offering amnesty to fighters. The SiPo rejected this entirely. In their view, any civilian in a partisan active region was potentially supporting partisans, making them legitimate targets. More than that, the SiPo argued that eliminating civilian populations would eliminate partisan bases of support, starving the insurgency at its source. This logic justified burning villages whose residents were merely suspected of providing food to partisans. It justified executing men simply because they were of military age. It justified treating entire ethnic groups, Jews, Romani, certain Slavic populations, as partisan sympathizers subject to collective punishment. The organizational structure of anti-partisan operations blurred lines between military and police authority in ways that facilitated atrocities. Nominally, the Wehrmacht held responsibility for rear area security. In practice, the SiPo played an increasingly dominant role. Each occupied region had a Kommandeur des Sicherheitspolizei, commander of the security police, who coordinated anti-partisan operations between SiPo units, order police battalions, Waffen-SS troops, and Wehrmacht rear area security divisions. These KNDS commanders operated with broad autonomy, often planning and executing anti-partisan sweeps without higher authorization. The decentralization meant that local commanders could interpret anti-partisan doctrine as broadly or brutally as they wished, knowing Berlin would accept high body counts as proof of aggressive security operations. Operation Cottbus in June 1943 demonstrated this methodology at scale. Named after a German city, the operation targeted partisan-controlled areas in southern Belarus using 15,000 troops from Wehrmacht, Waffen, SS, Order Police, and SiPo units. The stated objective was destroying partisan formations. The actual result was the murder of approximately 15,000 civilians, the burning of 349 villages, and the deportation of tens of thousands for forced labour. Only 692 weapons were captured, suggesting most victims were unarmed. The operations commander reported success based on the high death toll, not on any military objective achieved. This pattern repeated across hundreds of anti-partisan operations. Overwhelming force directed against predominantly civilian populations, justified afterward by claiming all dead were partisan supporters. The March 22nd, 1943 massacre at Katyn illustrated how anti-partisan operations transformed into pure terror. After partisans killed 4 German policemen near the Belarusian village, SiPo-directed units surrounded Katyn. They forced the village's entire population, 149 people, including 75 children, into a barn, locked the doors, and set it on fire. Those who tried to escape were shot. Only a handful survived. The perpetrators included a Ukrainian auxiliary police battalion working under SiPo command. Katyn became one of the best documented atrocities because Soviet authorities later turned it into a memorial, but it represented just one of thousands of similar operations across occupied Soviet territory. The SiPo maintained that such reprisals were necessary to deter partisan support. In reality, they often drove civilians into partisan ranks, creating the very security threats they claimed to be preventing. The interrogation of captured partisans revealed another dimension of SiPo: anti-partisan operations, intelligence exploitation through torture. When SiPo units captured suspected partisans or civilian supporters, they employed what internal documents called verschärfte Vernehmung, enhanced interrogation. The term masked systematic torture, beatings, near drowning, electric shocks, stress positions, exposure to extreme temperatures. The goal was extracting information about partisan movements, supply caches, and supporter networks. Some of this intelligence proved useful for subsequent operations. Much of it was false, provided by victims desperate to end torture. But usefulness wasn't the only goal. Torture also served as a terror weapon. Stories of what happened to people taken by the SiPo spread through occupied populations, creating an atmosphere where cooperating with partisans carried horrifying risks. The SiPo's use of local auxiliary forces dramatically expanded their anti-partisan capabilities, while also implicating local populations in German atrocities. In occupied Soviet territories, the SiPo recruited tens of thousands of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, and Cossacks into auxiliary police battalions. Some joined for ideological reasons: anti-communism, anti-Semitism, nationalism. Others joined for survival. Auxiliary police received better rations, their families gained protection, service offered escape from likely death as Soviet POWs. Whatever their motivations, these auxiliaries participated in anti-partisan operations that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The SiPo deliberately exploited ethnic tensions, using Ukrainian auxiliaries against Belarusian civilians, or vice versa, to fragment potential resistance along ethnic lines while deflecting blame onto local collaborators rather than German command. The statistical discrepancy between reported partisan and civilian casualties revealed the true nature of anti-partisan operations. German military records claim to have killed 780,000 bandits in anti-partisan operations through 1944. Soviet records documented 345,000 actual partisan deaths, less than half the German claim. The missing 435,000 victims were overwhelmingly civilians murdered in reprisal operations, village clearances, and sweeps through partisan active regions. The SiPo counted every dead body in an anti-partisan operation as a partisan killed, deliberately inflating their effectiveness while conducting what amounted to mass murder of non-combatants. The mathematical impossibility of the German claims killing more enemies than existed should have raised questions from Wehrmacht commanders. Instead, most accepted the inflated figures, either through indifference or complicity. The legal and moral frameworks that might have constrained anti-partisan operations had been deliberately dismantled. The Commissar Order of June 6, 1941 instructed Wehrmacht units to execute all captured Soviet political officers without trial, establishing that normal rules of war didn't apply on the Eastern Front. The Barbarossa Decree of May 13, 1941 exempted German forces from prosecution for crimes against Soviet civilians, effectively legalizing atrocities. These orders created an environment where the SiPo's extreme anti-partisan methods appeared consistent with broader policy rather than violations of military law. The few Wehrmacht officers who objected to SiPo brutality found no legal basis for intervention and risked their careers by complaining. The system had been designed to enable atrocity. The partisan war also revealed the strategic failure of SiPo methodology. Anti-partisan operations were supposed to eliminate resistance and secure rear areas. Instead, they drove recruitment to partisan movements, which grew from small bands in 1941 to an estimated 200,000 fighters by 1944. Entire regions of occupied Soviet territory became contested zones where German control existed only along major roads and in fortified towns. Villages destroyed by the SiPo became partisan bases. Civilians who lost family members to German reprisals joined resistance movements. The more brutally the SiPo suppressed partisans, the more partisans emerged. This created a self-perpetuating cycle, where security operations generated insecurity, justifying ever more brutal operations. The SiPo had trapped itself in a logic that led inevitably to escalating violence without achieving security objectives. By 1944, as the Soviet army advanced westward, it discovered the results of 3 years of SiPo anti-partisan operations. Vast regions depopulated, thousands of villages erased, forests filled with mass graves. The Soviet Extraordinary State Commission documented these atrocities extensively, though its reports mixed accurate documentation with propaganda exaggeration. Western historians initially dismissed these reports as Soviet fabrication during the Cold War. Only decades later, when German military and SiPo records became available, did the full scope of anti-partisan atrocities become undeniable. The partisan war, as conducted by the Sicherheitspolizei, had killed perhaps 500,000 civilians, not as collateral damage in military operations, but as deliberate policy predicated on the assumption that murdering populations would eliminate resistance. The policy failed, militarily, but it succeeded in revealing what police power became when unleashed without legal constraint in wartime, an instrument of mass murder that made no meaningful distinction between combatants and civilians, between justice and vengeance, between security and genocide. January 25, 1942, Berlin, Kurfürstenstraße 115 through 116. Adolf Eichmann stood before a wall-sized map of Europe, coloured pins marking Jewish populations in every occupied territory and allied nation. Blue pins for populations under 5,000, yellow pins for 5,000 to 50,000, red pins for populations exceeding 50,000. The map looked like an epidemiologist's tracking of disease spread, which perhaps revealed how Eichmann viewed his work. He commanded Referat IVB4, the Jewish Affairs Desk of the RSHA, and his office had become the logistical centre of the Holocaust. Every deportation train required coordination. Scheduling with Deutsche Reichsbahn, securing locomotives and rolling stock, calculating distances and transit times, coordinating arrival schedules with destination camps, arranging security for transports, documenting passengers. Eichmann's department processed this information with industrial efficiency. He spoke of deportations using language borrowed from manufacturing: throughput, capacity, processing rates. His greatest professional pride came from optimizing this system, eliminating bottlenecks, increasing efficiency. He was murdering millions and measuring his success by improved logistics. The banality of this bureaucratic mass murder became almost unbearable in its mundanity. Morning meetings at Eichmann's office resembled any corporate logistics operation. Department heads reported on current deportation schedules: 47 trains this month, average load 1,000 passengers per train. Destinations: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor. Delays were discussed not as moral questions, but as operational problems to be solved. A transport from France delayed 3 days because of railway scheduling conflicts. Find alternative routing. A deportation from the Netherlands running below capacity because the Jewish population in that district was depleted. Adjust future quotas. People had become statistics, murder had become administration, and Holocaust had become paperwork. The financial dimension of this bureaucracy revealed another layer of systematic exploitation. Deportees were legally required to settle all debts before deportation, effectively confiscating whatever they still possessed. The RSHA coordinated with the Finance Ministry to ensure confiscated property was properly documented and distributed to the Reich Treasury. Currency, jewellery, and valuables were processed through special SS accounts. Real estate was transferred to German ownership. Even the clothing and luggage taken from deportees at death camps was returned to Germany for distribution. The Holocaust generated enormous economic value for the Nazi state, and the SiPo administered much of this confiscation bureaucracy. They weren't just killing Jews, they were systematically looting them first. The relationship between Eichmann's deportation machinery and the physical extermination sites revealed the Holocaust's assembly line structure. Eichmann's office didn't run the death camps, those fell under a different SS department, but they controlled the flow of victims to those camps. This created a grotesque supply chain relationship. Camps informed Eichmann's office of their capacity, how many people they could murder per day. Eichmann's office scheduled transports to match that capacity, ensuring camps operated at maximum efficiency without overwhelming their killing infrastructure. When Auschwitz expanded its gas chambers in 1943, Eichmann's office increased deportation schedules from Hungary, Greece, and Western Europe to utilize the increased capacity. It was logistics management applied to genocide. The role of the Deutsche Reichsbahn German railways in this system demonstrated how genocide required cooperation from ostensibly normal institutions. Every deportation train needed to be scheduled into the existing passenger and freight network. The railways charged standard rates for these transports, third-class passenger fares for adults, half price for children under 4, no charge for children under 2, with a group discount for shipments over 400 passengers. The railways billed the RSHA, which paid from confiscated Jewish assets, meaning Jews effectively paid for their own deportation. Railway officials knew what these trains carried deportation schedules were labelled Jews or Jewish resettlers in internal documents, yet maintained efficient service throughout the war. The railways treated Holocaust trains as routine business. The Action Reinhard camps Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec existed solely because the SiPo coordinated their construction and operation as part of the Final Solutions administrative infrastructure. Named after Reinhard Heydrich following his assassination, Action Reinhard was the code name for exterminating Poland's Jewish population. The 3 camps, small facilities disguised as transit camps, murdered approximately 1,800,000 people between July 1942 and November 1943. The SiPo's role extended beyond supplying victims. SiPo officers supervised security around the camps, ensured local populations remained ignorant of their true purpose, coordinated the disposal of confiscated property, and maintained the fiction that deportees were being resettled further east. When these camps closed in late 1943, SiPo units demolished the facilities and planted forests over the sites to hide evidence. The documentation obsession that characterized all SiPo operations continued even into genocide. Manifests listed every person on deportation trains by name, age, and origin. Property inventories catalogued confiscated goods down to individual items. Death certificates were sometimes issued for deportees who died in transit, maintaining a facade of legal procedure. Even at death camps, records were kept of arrivals, selections, and property processing. This documentation served multiple purposes. It allowed the RSHA to track deportation progress. It protected SiPo officers from accusations of corruption by documenting property confiscation, and it maintained the bureaucratic illusion that these were legitimate state operations. The Nazis created a comprehensive paper trail of genocide. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Eichmann and thousands of other SiPo bureaucrats to participate in this system revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and modern institutions. Physical distance from killing helped. Eichmann never personally murdered anyone, so he could tell himself he merely processed paperwork. Bureaucratic language created emotional distance. People became units. Murder became special treatment. Deportation became resettlement. Division of labour diffused responsibility. Eichmann arranged trains, others selected victims, still others operated gas chambers. No individual bore complete responsibility. Career advancement incentivized cooperation. Promotions went to efficient officers. Objections marked one as unsuited for important work. And ideology provided justification. Deportees weren't innocent civilians, but existential threats whose elimination served national security. Yet the bureaucrats of death knew exactly what they were doing. Post-war testimony, attempting to portray ignorance or incomprehension, was contradicted by contemporary documents. Internal RSHA memoranda discussed special treatment in contexts that made clear it meant killing. Transport coordinators knew that 3 million people had been deported and effectively disappeared. Where could they have gone if not to death? Eichmann himself visited Auschwitz and witnessed selections and gassings. These men didn't participate in genocide through ignorance, but through a willful determination to continue advancing their careers and following orders regardless of moral implications. The banality of evil lay precisely in this. They treated genocide as administrative work, applying professional competence to monstrous ends. The failure of competence. Deportation resistance within German society revealed how thoroughly the SiPo's bureaucratic approach normalized the Holocaust. Deportations occurred from neighborhoods in broad daylight. Families were loaded onto trains at regular passenger stations. Non-Jewish neighbors watched from windows as their Jewish neighbors were taken away with suitcases. The deportees literally disappeared. Letters stopped. Possessions were auctioned. Homes were reassigned to German families. Yet resistance to this process remained minimal. The combination of SiPo terror opposing deportations might mean arrest and bureaucratic legitimacy. Deportations followed official procedures with proper documentation, pacified potential opposition. The Holocaust happened in public, administered through official channels, and most people simply looked away. By 1944, as Allied armies closed in and Germany faced military collapse, the deportation machinery continued operating with bureaucratic determination. Eichmann's office organised the deportation of 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz between May and July 1944, even as Wehrmacht resources were desperately needed at collapsing fronts. Rail cars that might have transported military supplies instead transported victims. Guards who might have reinforced frontline units instead escorted deportation trains. The Holocaust had become a priority unto itself, continuing through rational bureaucratic administration even when it actively harmed Germany's military position. The SiPo had created an administrative apparatus so efficient, so normalized, so self-perpetuating that it continued operations independent of strategic logic. The bureaucrats of death had built a machine that would run until physically stopped by military defeat. And by then, the map on Eichmann's wall would show pins removed, one by one, as Jewish communities across Europe were exterminated through the methodical, documented, carefully administered genocide that was the Holocaust. November 4th, 1941, Berlin, Prinz-Albrecht-Straße 8. The man sat in a basement cell of the Gestapo headquarters awaiting interrogation. He had been arrested 3 days earlier, pulled from his apartment by two plainclothes officers who showed him a typewritten detention order stamped with an official seal. The document cited no specific crime, no charges, no trial date. It simply invoked Schutzhaft protective custody, the legal fiction that allowed the Gestapo to imprison anyone indefinitely without judicial oversight. He had spent 3 days in these cells, hearing screams from other prisoners being interrogated, watching guards bring thin soup twice daily, wondering what would happen next. Above him, Gestapo officers processed files on their desks, adding names to transport lists, deciding which prisoners would be released, which would be sent to concentration camps, which would disappear entirely. The decision would be made without trial, without defence, without appeal. The SiPo had become judge, jury, and executioner. And the concentration camp system existed as the infrastructure for this extra-legal detention apparatus. The relationship between the Sicherheitspolizei and the concentration camp system was symbiotic, but often misunderstood. The camps themselves were run by the SS Totenkopfverbände, Death's Head Units, a separate SS branch under the command of Theodor Eicke. The SiPo didn't operate the camps, but they filled them. Every concentration camp prisoner arrived through one of several pipelines: court sentences for criminal offences, Gestapo Schutzhaft orders, SD targeting of political opponents, Kripo roundups of asocials, or transfer from occupied territories. The Gestapo alone was responsible for 70 to 80% of concentration camp admissions through 1944. Without the SiPo's arrest and detention apparatus, the camp system would have had no prisoners. The administrative process of sending someone to a concentration camp revealed the bureaucratic machinery connecting SiPo and camps. A local Gestapo office arrested someone, perhaps based on denunciation, surveillance, or simply arbitrary suspicion. The arrestee was held in Gestapo cells or local police detention while their case was reviewed. A Gestapo officer examined the file and made a recommendation: release, continued detention, or transfer to a concentration camp. If transfer was ordered, the prisoner was added to the next transport. Transport schedules were coordinated with camp administrations to ensure camps had capacity. The prisoner, still having never seen a judge or courtroom, was loaded onto a prisoner transport train under guard and delivered to a camp where SS camp guards took custody. The entire process bypassed the judicial system completely. The coloured triangle system at concentration camps included categories that revealed SiPo priorities. Political prisoners wore red triangles. These were communists, socialists, resistance members, anyone arrested for political opposition. Criminals wore green triangles. These included actual criminals, but also people arrested by the Kripo for multiple offences or habitual offences. Black triangles marked asocials, homeless people, sex workers, anyone the SiPo deemed socially undesirable. Pink triangles identified homosexual men arrested under paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code and sent to camps by the Gestapo. Jehovah's Witnesses, who refused military service and declined to say Heil Hitler, wore purple triangles. Jews arriving through SiPo arrests wore yellow stars, later replaced by yellow triangles. The triangle system externalized the SiPo's categorization of threats and undesirables, making visible the ideological priorities that drove arrest patterns. The 14F13 program demonstrated the direct collaboration between SiPo and camp administrations in systematic killing. Beginning in 1941, the Gestapo and Kripo identified concentration camp prisoners deemed too ill, too injured, or too weak to work. These prisoners were selected for Action 14F13, a program that transferred them to psychiatric hospitals where they were murdered through the T4 euthanasia program's killing centers. The program murdered approximately 14,000 concentration camp prisoners by the time it ended in 1943. The selection process itself was telling. SiPo officials visited camps, reviewed prisoner files, and designated prisoners for transfer based on productivity assessments. Concentration camps were supposed to provide labour. Prisoners who couldn't work were eliminated. The SiPo provided the bureaucratic mechanism for making those decisions. Tension existed between SiPo objectives and camp administration priorities, particularly regarding economic exploitation. By 1942, German industry desperately needed labour, and concentration camps represented a vast workforce. The SS camp administration began leasing prisoners to German corporations, IG, Farben, Krupp, Siemens, thousands of smaller companies. This created pressure to keep prisoners alive and working. But the SiPo continued sending political prisoners, Jews, and others to camps with implicit death sentences. The Gestapo wanted camps as detention and terror facilities. The camp administration wanted them as labour sources. This tension never fully resolved, resulting in camps that simultaneously served as forced labour sites and killing centres, a contradiction embodied most starkly at Auschwitz, where some arrivals were selected for labour while others went directly to gas chambers. The Gestapo's interrogation facility at Prinz-Albrecht-Straße 8 functioned as a miniature concentration camp within SiPo headquarters. The building's basement contained cells where prisoners could be held during investigation. Interrogation rooms featured equipment for torture, though. Gestapo records euphemistically described interrogation techniques as enhanced measures or intensive questioning. Prisoners held here existed in a legal black hole, not formally charged, not in police custody in any traditional sense, not protected by any rights or procedures. Some were released after days or weeks. Others were transferred to concentration camps. Some simply disappeared. The site demonstrated that the SiPo didn't need concentration camps to function as instruments of terror. They could imprison and torture directly from their own facilities. The mass arrests following Kristallnacht in November 1938 revealed the SiPo's capacity to flood the camp system with prisoners as a terror weapon. Following the orchestrated violence against Jewish communities, the Gestapo arrested approximately 30,000 Jewish men across Germany and Austria. Within days, they were transported to concentration camps, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, overwhelming camp capacity. The arrests weren't based on any individual actions, but collective punishment designed to terrorise Germany's Jewish population into emigration. Most were eventually released after weeks or months in camps, having signed over property and possessions and promising to leave Germany. The operation demonstrated the SiPo's power to use camp detention as a mass coercion tool, arresting thousands without charges and releasing them only after they'd been broken physically and economically. The evolution of the camp system through 1944 tracked closely with SiPo operations in occupied territories. As the Einsatzgruppen and deportation machinery expanded the Holocaust's scope, camps in occupied Poland transitioned from detention facilities to extermination centres. The SiPo coordinated deportations to these camps, secured their perimeters, and maintained the fiction of secrecy. When camps like Treblinka and Sobibor closed in late 1943, SiPo units supervised their demolition and the disposal of evidence. The SiPo acted as the interface between the killing centres and the outside world, ensuring victims arrived, witnesses were eliminated, and evidence was concealed. As 1945 approached and Allied armies closed in, the SiPo faced the problem of concentration camp evidence. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners remained alive in camps across Germany and occupied territories. Documents detailed who had been arrested, when, and why, creating a comprehensive record of SiPo crimes. The response revealed the system's fundamental nature. Rather than release prisoners or improve conditions, the SiPo organised death marches, forced evacuations of camps ahead of Allied advances, where prisoners were marched hundreds of kilometres in winter without adequate food, clothing, or shelter. Tens of thousands died on these marches. Those too weak to walk were shot. The death marches demonstrated that even in defeat, the SiPo prioritised preventing prisoner liberation over any humanitarian considerations. The camps and the SiPo that filled them had become so thoroughly integrated that their collapse would be equally chaotic and violent. January 20th, 1942, noon. Am Großem Wannsee, 56-58, Berlin. The villa overlooking Lake Wannsee had been confiscated from a Jewish industrialist and converted into a guest house for SS officers, a bit of grim symbolism perhaps lost on the 15 men who gathered there that winter day. They entered through the villa's columned portico, surrendered their coats, and assembled in the dining room where a buffet lunch awaited them. The atmosphere was collegial, almost social. These were senior bureaucrats, most of them doctors of law or philosophy, educated men who ran government ministries and party offices. Reinhard Heydrich, hosting the conference as chief of the SiPo security police, welcomed them with characteristic efficiency. The meeting had been scheduled twice before and postponed once for Pearl Harbor and American entry into the war, once for Heydrich's administrative duties as acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. Now, finally convened, it would last barely 90 minutes. In that time, the participants would coordinate the administrative machinery of genocide across an entire continent. The Wannsee Conference has achieved mythic status in Holocaust history, often misunderstood as the moment the final solution was decided. In reality, the killing had already begun. The Einsatzgruppen had murdered over 500,000 Soviet Jews. The death camps at Chelmno and Belzec were already operational or under construction. Deportations from Western Europe had commenced. What Wannsee accomplished was different and perhaps more disturbing. It transformed the Holocaust from scattered killing operations into a unified, coordinated administrative program with clearly assigned institutional responsibilities. The meeting wasn't about whether to commit genocide, but about how to administer it efficiently. Heydrich's opening statement established his authority unambiguously. Hitler's January 30th, 1941 directive had appointed Heydrich as plenipotentiary for the preparation of the final solution of the Jewish question. The exact wording of that directive has never been found. It was likely verbal, not written, but Heydrich's invocation of Hitler's authorization ensured no attendee would question his leadership. He then outlined what had already occurred. The emigration phase was complete, replaced by evacuation to the east as a new solution with the Führer's permission. Evacuation to the east was euphemistic language that all attendees understood meant murder. Heydrich's briefing made clear that extermination policy had already been decided at the highest level. This conference existed to ensure all relevant agencies coordinated their implementation. Adolf Eichmann, serving as conference secretary, distributed a statistical chart he had prepared showing Jewish populations across Europe. 11 million people in 31 countries, including nations not yet occupied like Britain and neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden. The chart represented targets categorised by current location and accessibility. The numbers were precise: 74,200 in France, 330,000 in the British mainland, 5 million in the Soviet Union. This granular demographic data demonstrated how thoroughly the RSHA had mapped Jewish populations across an entire continent. The 11 million figure would become notorious after the war, as evidence of the Holocaust's intended scope. But at Wannsee, it served a bureaucratic purpose: establishing workload estimates for the extermination program. The substantive discussion focused on two technical issues that revealed the mindset of the participants. First, who exactly counted as Jewish for purposes of the final solution? Germany's Nuremberg laws had created complex racial categories: full Jews, half Jews, quarter Jews, Jews by religion versus Jews by descent. Heydrich proposed that half Jews and Jews in mixed marriages should generally be sterilised rather than deported to avoid arousing opposition from their German relatives. The ensuing discussion debated these categorizations with scholarly precision. At what percentage of Jewish ancestry did someone become subject to extermination? The participants discussed mass murder using the clinical terminology of racial classification, demonstrating how ideology and bureaucracy combined to make genocide seem like an administrative problem requiring technical solutions. Second, the conference addressed jurisdictional questions about Jewish populations in occupied territories and satellite states. Which ministry would handle deportations from France? Who had authority over Jews in the general government? How should they approach satellite nations like Romania or Hungary, where local governments currently controlled Jewish populations? These jurisdictional disputes where real Nazi bureaucracy was notoriously competitive, with different agencies jealously guarding their authority. The conference served to delineate clear responsibilities. The SiPo would coordinate overall policy and deportations. The civilian administrations in occupied territories would cooperate with SiPo requirements. The Foreign Ministry would handle negotiations with satellite governments. Genocide required coordination, and coordination required clear organisational charts. Wilhelm Stuckart from the Interior Ministry raised concerns about the practical difficulties of implementing the final solution given the number of people involved and the disruption to wartime production. He didn't object to the policy on moral grounds. Stuckart had co-authored the Nuremberg Laws and was thoroughly committed to Nazi racial ideology. His objections were purely practical. Wouldn't forced sterilisation be more efficient than deportation and killing for certain categories? The response, captured in Eichmann's minutes, was that the Führer had decided on evacuation rather than sterilisation. The exchange revealed that the extermination policy came from the top and was not subject to bureaucratic revision, only administrative implementation. The aftermath of the conference demonstrated its significance. 30 copies of the protocol were distributed to key ministries and agencies, ensuring everyone understood their roles. These weren't secret documents meant for destruction, but working papers distributed through normal bureaucratic channels, more evidence that participants saw this as legitimate government policy. Eichmann later testified that after the formal meeting ended, Heydrich, Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller, and Eichmann stayed behind to drink cognac and smoke cigars, relaxing in self-congratulation. Heydrich was particularly pleased that the meeting had proceeded without opposition or significant complications. The administrative apparatus of genocide had received institutional buy-in from Germany's government bureaucracy. The Wannsee Conference changed nothing about the decision to commit genocide. That decision had already been made and was already being implemented. What it changed was the institutional commitment to that genocide. Before Wannsee, the Holocaust was primarily a SiPo and SS operation, with other agencies cooperating when required. After Wannsee, it became a government-wide program with clearly assigned responsibilities across multiple ministries. The Foreign Ministry would negotiate with satellite states for deportation of their Jewish populations. The Justice Ministry would provide legal cover for confiscation of property. The Transport Ministry would provide rolling stock for deportations. The Interior Ministry would handle questions of citizenship and legal status. Heydrich had transformed the Holocaust from a police action into a state project. The bureaucratic character of the conference, the careful minutes, the statistical charts, the jurisdictional discussions revealed something profound about how genocide functions in modern bureaucratic states. These 15 men weren't monsters in any traditional sense. Most held advanced degrees. Several had families. They represented the educated professional class of German society. Yet they spent 90 minutes discussing the most efficient methods for murdering 11 million people, then adjourned for lunch and cognac. The horror of Wannsee lies not in sadistic violence, but in cold administrative planning, genocide as a policy problem requiring interagency coordination, statistical analysis, and careful scheduling. The villa on Lake Wannsee that January afternoon was where the SiPo's greatest achievement became reality: the complete merger of security services, state bureaucracy, and industrial organisation in service of systematic extermination. May 27th, 1942, 10:32 a.m. Prague, Holešovice district. The green Mercedes convertible slowed as it approached the sharp curve at the intersection of Kirch-Majerova and Zenklova streets. Inside sat Reinhard Heydrich, acting Reich, protector of Bohemia and Moravia, travelling without escort from his country residence to Prague Castle. His driver navigated the turn carefully. The car decelerated. On the sidewalk, Joseph Gabčík raised a Sten submachine gun from beneath his raincoat and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The weapon jammed. Heydrich stood up in the convertible, drawing his pistol, shouting at his driver to stop. In that moment, Jan Kubiš stepped forward and hurled a modified anti-tank grenade. The explosion tore through the Mercedes' right rear wheel, sending shrapnel through the vehicle's body and into Heydrich's torso. The most powerful security official in Nazi-occupied Europe had been ambushed by 2 Czech paratroopers trained in Britain and infiltrated back into their homeland. The man who had organised the infrastructure of the Holocaust would die from an assassin's bomb, and Czechoslovakia would pay in blood for his death. The immediate aftermath revealed both Heydrich's vulnerability and the limits of SiPo security. Despite commanding tens of thousands of security personnel across occupied Europe, despite maintaining surveillance networks and informant systems that penetrated every level of society, Heydrich travelled with minimal protection. His car had no armour. His security detail that morning consisted only of his driver. He followed predictable routes at regular times. This wasn't arrogance exactly, though Heydrich certainly possessed that quality, but rather a calculated projection of invulnerability. To travel with heavy security would suggest fear, would imply that resistance posed a genuine threat. Heydrich's light security was a political statement. It said, "We control you so completely that your most powerful oppressor can drive unguarded through your capital." The assassination proved that statement catastrophically wrong. Heydrich survived the initial attack, staggering from his damaged car to pursue his attackers before collapsing. He was taken to Bulovka Hospital where German doctors treated his injuries: shrapnel wounds, rib fractures, a ruptured diaphragm. Initially, survival seemed possible. The wounds were serious but not immediately fatal. But within days, Heydrich developed signs of infection. Whether from the grenade fragments, which may have been wrapped in horsehair or other contaminated materials by British intelligence, or from standard battlefield contamination, septicemia spread through his body. German physicians administered the best medical treatment available in 1942, but antibiotics effective against severe systemic infection didn't yet exist. On June 4th, 8 days after the attack, Heydrich died. He was 38 years old. He had commanded the Sicherheitspolizei for 6 years and built it into the most feared security apparatus in Europe. A modified anti-tank grenade and septic infection had ended that career permanently. The Nazi response revealed the difference between calculated terror and blind vengeance. When the SiPo operated according to Heydrich's methodology, violence was systematic, documented, directed towards strategic objectives. When the SiPo operated from rage after Heydrich's death, violence became indiscriminate, excessive, counterproductive. Hitler reportedly wanted 10,000 Czechs executed immediately in reprisal. Karl Hermann Frank, now the senior SS and police leader in Bohemia, Moravia, convinced him that such mass executions would paralyze the Protectorate's war production. Instead, Frank implemented a reprisal campaign that killed approximately 1,300 Czechs in the immediate aftermath, with thousands more arrested and deported to concentration camps. But the reprisals followed no careful targeting. They hit randomly selected hostages, people with tangential connections to resistance, anyone whose arrest might pressure someone else to provide information. The destruction of Lidice became the most infamous reprisal, though it represented just one of several complete village annihilations. On June 9th, 1942, SiPo intelligence erroneously identified Lidice as having sheltered the paratroopers. The information was false, but once the village was targeted, accuracy became irrelevant. SiPo and order police units surrounded Lidice, separated the men from women and children, and executed 173 males over age 15 in the village's Horak farm. The women, 195 total, were transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children, 98, were taken for racial examination. 17, deemed sufficiently Germanic, were sent to German families for adoption, while the remaining 81 were gassed at Chelmno extermination camp. The village itself was burned, demolished, and ploughed under. Lidice was erased as a warning. But the warning backfired internationally. The massacre generated significant negative publicity, with American and British media highlighting Nazi brutality and several towns renaming themselves Lidice in solidarity. The manhunt for the assassins mobilized unprecedented security resources. 5,000 SiPo officers, Wehrmacht troops, and Waffen-SS soldiers swept through Prague. Checkpoints paralyzed transportation. Curfews locked down the city. The SiPo offered 1 million Reichsmarks reward for information, leading to the assassins' capture an enormous sum, equivalent to years of working-class wages. They arrested 13,000 Czechs for questioning, holding most briefly, but deporting hundreds to concentration camps. They executed anyone found to have provided even minimal assistance to the paratroopers. A family that gave them a glass of water, a priest who heard their confession, a resistance member who provided false documents. The dragnet demonstrated the SiPo's capacity for mobilization when sufficiently motivated, but it also revealed limitations. Despite overwhelming force and massive rewards, the assassins evaded capture for weeks. The final confrontation at the Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius on June 18th showed both the assassins' courage and the SiPo's willingness to use overwhelming force against cornered opponents. Karol Czurda, a Czech paratrooper from a different mission, betrayed the safe houses in exchange for the reward money. The SiPo discovered that Gabčík, Kubiš, and 5 other paratroopers were hiding in the church's crypt. At 4:30 a.m., 800 SS and Gestapo surrounded the building. The resistance fighters refused surrender. For 6 hours, they held off the assault with limited ammunition. The SiPo brought fire trucks to flood the crypt. They attempted to blow holes in the walls. They threw smoke grenades and tear gas canisters through the ventilation shafts. Finally, out of ammunition and facing rising water, the 3 remaining paratroopers, Gabčík, had been killed in the initial assault, committed suicide rather than surrender. The SiPo response was to execute everyone associated with the church: the priest who provided sanctuary, his family, his associates. The question of whether Operation Anthropoid achieved its strategic objectives remained controversial among Czech resistance and the exiled government. The assassination eliminated Heydrich, removing one of Nazi Germany's most capable and ruthless administrators. It demonstrated that even the highest-ranking Nazi officials were vulnerable, potentially deterring other officials from accepting occupation posts. It proved that Czech resistance existed and could strike dramatically, but the reprisals were devastating. Over 1,300 Czechs were executed in direct reprisal, thousands more were arrested, entire villages were destroyed, and the broader Czech resistance network was severely damaged by the subsequent crackdown. Some Czech resistance leaders argued that the cost in Czech lives far exceeded the value of killing one Nazi official, no matter how powerful. Others maintained that resistance required such actions to demonstrate that occupation would never be accepted, regardless of the price. The organizational response within the SiPo revealed the depth of institutionalization Heydrich had achieved. Despite losing their architect and commander, the Sicherheitspolizei continued operating without significant disruption. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, appointed to succeed Heydrich as chief of the RSHA in January 1943, maintained existing policies and structures. The deportation machinery continued processing transports. The Einsatzgruppen continued killing operations in occupied Soviet territories. The camp system continued receiving prisoners through Gestapo arrests. The surveillance networks continued monitoring populations. Heydrich had built an apparatus that no longer required his personal leadership to function. This institutionalization was perhaps his greatest and most disturbing legacy, a killing machine that would continue operating until physically destroyed by military defeat. The impact on Heydrich's family added a personal dimension to the historical narrative. His widow, Lena, received a generous pension and retained property confiscated from Czech Jews. She lived comfortably in Germany until her death in 1985, never expressing remorse for her husband's role in the Holocaust. Her post-war interviews revealed her continued belief in Nazi ideology and her view of Heydrich as a misunderstood patriot serving his country. 2 of their 4 children died in a traffic accident in 1943. The surviving sons grew up in post-war Germany bearing their father's name and legacy. One became an engineer and lived quietly, refusing interviews about his father. The burden of being Heydrich's children followed them throughout their lives, a personal inheritance of guilt by association that they never chose. The memory of Heydrich's assassination lived differently in different contexts. In Czechoslovakia, Gabčík and Kubiš became national heroes, martyrs who struck back against occupation regardless of the cost. The rebuilt Legalized became a memorial site, an international symbol of Nazi brutality. But in some Czech families who lost relatives to the reprisals, ambivalence persisted. Was killing Heydrich worth the lives of their loved ones? In Britain, Operation Anthropoid was celebrated as one of Special Operations Executive's most successful missions, proof that occupied populations could fight back with Allied support. In Germany, Heydrich was mourned by Nazi true believers who saw him as a fallen hero, while the post-war generation learned to view him as one of the Holocaust's primary architects. The competing memories of Heydrich and his death reflected broader questions about resistance, reprisal, and the moral calculus of fighting totalitarian occupation. The assassination's timing proved tragically ironic. Heydrich died just weeks after the Wannsee Conference had solidified institutional coordination for the final solution. He lived long enough to see his organizational masterpiece, the integration of security services, state bureaucracy, and industrial killing, become operational reality. He died before its full consequences became apparent, before the Allied discovery of death camps, before the term Holocaust entered historical vocabulary. In some ways, he escaped accountability. He never faced trial, never answered for his crimes, never confronted the magnitude of suffering his organization had inflicted. He died believing his system would triumph. The paratroopers who killed him ensured he wouldn't live to see its defeat, but they couldn't destroy the apparatus he'd built. That would require 4 more years of war and the complete military destruction of Nazi Germany. July 22nd, 1942, Warsaw Ghetto, occupied Poland. The Umschlagplatz, the assembly point filled with people carrying suitcases, bundles, whatever possessions they could hold. SiPo officers moved through the crowd with casual efficiency, checking papers, directing people toward the waiting freight cars. To the assembled Jews, this appeared to be the resettlement to labor camps in the east that German notices had announced. The notices promised work, adequate food, better conditions than the overcrowded ghetto. Families stayed together. People brought tools and clothing appropriate for resettlement. What they didn't know, what the SiPo deliberately concealed, was that the trains went to Treblinka, 62 miles northeast, where gas chambers disguised as shower facilities would murder them within hours of arrival. This was the Großaktion Warschau, the Great Action in Warsaw, and it would deport 265,000 Jews to their deaths in just 6 weeks. The SiPo had perfected the machinery of deception and murder. The ghetto liquidations across occupied Poland represented the SiPo's operational methodology at its most developed. These weren't spontaneous massacres or hasty operations, but carefully planned, multi-week campaigns that combined deception, psychological manipulation, selective violence, and industrial-scale logistics. Each liquidation followed a similar pattern, refined through repetition until the process became standardized. First came escalating restrictions, reduced food rations, expanded forced labor requirements, increased arbitrary violence that weakened resistance capacity. Then came the deceptive announcement: labor, conscription, population transfer, resettlement. Then came the selection process at assembly points, where SiPo officers separated those deemed fit for labor from those designated for immediate murder. Finally came the deportation trains, the illusion maintained until the final moments at the death camp gates. The role of the Jewish Council's Judenräte in this process created one of the Holocaust's most agonizing moral dilemmas. The Germans had established these councils in each ghetto, appointing Jewish leaders to administer internal ghetto affairs under German supervision. During liquidations, the SiPo demanded that Jewish council members compile lists, organize assembly points, and encourage compliance with deportation orders. Council members faced an impossible choice: cooperate with deportations, or face immediate execution and replacement by someone more pliant. Some council leaders believed cooperation might save at least some Jews if they helped select workers for deportation. Perhaps the elderly and children would be spared. Others calculated that resistance would be crushed immediately while cooperation bought time. In practice, their cooperation facilitated murder. The SiPo had weaponized Jewish self-governance, forcing Jews to participate in their own destruction. The Krakow ghetto liquidation on March 13th and 14th, 1943 demonstrated the brutal efficiency of evolved SiPo methodology. At dawn, SiPo and SS units surrounded the ghetto, approximately 2,000 Germans and Ukrainian auxiliaries. They moved systematically through every building, forcing residents into the streets. Those deemed fit for labor, approximately 2,000 people, were marched to Poichal labor camp. Those deemed unfit for work, approximately 8,000 people, were loaded onto trains for deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Approximately 2,000 people, mostly elderly or disabled, were shot in the streets where they were found, their bodies left where they fell as a terror demonstration. The entire operation took less than 2 days. The SiPo had practiced in other ghettos, and Kraków benefited, if that's the appropriate word, from that accumulated experience. They knew exactly how many troops were needed, how to prevent escape, how to process thousands of people efficiently. Resistance, when it emerged, forced the SiPo to modify their tactics but never stop the liquidations. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising that began April 1943 was the largest and most famous resistance action. Approximately 750 Jewish fighters with improvised weapons and limited ammunition fought 2,000 German troops, including SiPo and Waffen-SS units, for 27 days. The SiPo response revealed their capabilities when facing armed resistance. They systematically burned the ghetto block by block, using flamethrowers and demolition charges to destroy buildings and bunkers. They flooded sewers where resistance fighters hid. They brought in artillery and heavy weapons. The suppression killed approximately 13,000 Jews, some in combat, most murdered when discovered in hiding, and deported approximately 50,000 survivors to Treblinka and labor camps. The SiPo prevailed through overwhelming force and willingness to destroy the entire ghetto infrastructure. Similar patterns of resistance and suppression occurred in ghettos across occupied Poland. In Białystok, August 1943, resistance fighters held out for 5 days before being overwhelmed. In Vilna, September 1943, the underground leadership debated whether to fight or flee to nearby forests. Ultimately, both resistance and flight occurred, with mixed success. In Minsk, repeated resistance actions throughout 1942 and early 1943 enabled thousands to escape to partisan units before the final liquidation in September 1943. But no resistance succeeded in preventing liquidation. At best, resistance saved some lives through enabling escapes, bought time for underground movements to organize, and demonstrated that Jews would fight back despite impossible odds. The SiPo always won the liquidations themselves because they controlled overwhelming military force and operated without any moral or legal constraints. The economic dimension of ghetto liquidations demonstrated the SiPo's role in the Holocaust's financial exploitation. Before deportations, the SiPo organized collection of all valuables: gold, jewelry, currency, anything of value. They established warehouses called Effektenlager to sort and catalogue confiscated property. Clothing was processed for reuse. Furniture and household goods were distributed to ethnic German settlers. Valuables were converted to currency or sent to the Reichsbank. The SiPo administered this massive theft operation with the same meticulous record-keeping they applied to everything else. Detailed inventories, tracked property confiscation, transportation manifests, documented valuables shipped to Germany. The murder of Polish Jews generated enormous economic value for the Nazi state, and the SiPo ensured that value was captured systematically. The deception maintained until the final moments revealed the SiPo's understanding of crowd control psychology. At Treblinka, arriving deportees from Warsaw were told they had reached a transit camp. They were directed to hand over valuables for safekeeping. They were instructed to undress for showers and delousing. They were given towels and soap to maintain the illusion. Only in the final moments, as they were forced into the gas chamber disguised as a shower room, did many realize the truth. This elaborate deception served practical purposes. It prevented panic and resistance that might disrupt the killing process. It reduced the number of guards needed to control crowds. It made the process psychologically easier for the perpetrators, who could tell themselves victims died without knowing their fate. The deception also revealed the SiPo's cynical sophistication. They understood that people facing unthinkable horror would cling to any narrative suggesting survival, and they exploited that hope ruthlessly. The statistics of ghetto liquidation are almost incomprehensible in their magnitude. The Warsaw Ghetto, which at its peak contained 450,000 Jews, was liquidated in 3 major actions between July 1942 and May 1943. The Łódź Ghetto, with approximately 200,000 Jews, was liquidated between January and September 1944. The Krakow ghetto, 68,000 Jews, liquidated March 1943. Białystok, 50,000 Jews, liquidated November 1943. Vilna, 60,000 Jews, liquidated September 1943. The smaller ghettos numbered in hundreds. In total, approximately 3 million Polish Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, with the majority killed during the ghetto liquidation campaigns of 1942 through 1944. The SiPo coordinated, organized, and executed this continental-scale murder through methodical planning, deceptive procedures, and relentless operational tempo. The testimony of survivors who escaped liquidations through hiding, false papers, or resistance provided crucial evidence for post-war understanding. They described the SiPo's procedures in detail: the selection process at the Umschlagplatz, the conditions in the cattle cars, the realization that came too late for most. They testified about the Jewish police, who rounded up deportees, the Ukrainian auxiliaries who guarded transports, the German SiPo officers who supervised operations. Their testimony revealed not mindless violence, but calculated, systematic murder administered through normal bureaucratic channels. The SiPo officers conducting liquidations worked regular hours, filed reports, took meal breaks. They approached mass murder as a job requiring professional competence. This normalization of genocide, treating it as routine administrative work, may be the most disturbing aspect of the ghetto liquidations. By the end of 1944, virtually all ghettos in occupied Poland had been liquidated. The Jewish communities that had existed in Poland for 1,000 years, that had produced rich cultural, religious, and intellectual traditions, that had numbered 3.5 million people before the war, were gone. The SiPo had been the primary instrument of their destruction. They had organized the ghettoization, enforced the restrictions, coordinated the deportations, supervised the selections, maintained the deceptions, and ensured the efficiency of the killing process. The ghetto liquidations represented the SiPo's role in the Holocaust at its most visible and devastating, turning populated neighborhoods into empty ruins, transforming communities into corpses, and doing it all through methodical, documented, bureaucratically administered mass murder that they continued to categorize as security operations. August 1st, 1944, 5 p.m., Warsaw, occupied Poland. The church bells of Warsaw rang 5 times, and the city exploded. From windows across the Polish capital, resistance fighters opened fire on German patrols. Homemade grenades detonated outside Wehrmacht administrative buildings. Barricades constructed from paving stones and overturned trams appeared across major intersections. The Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, had launched a general uprising, timing their assault for the moment when the Soviet army, just 12 miles east across the Vistula River, seemed poised to liberate the city. The uprising would last 63 days, cost over 200,000 lives, and end with Warsaw's systematic destruction. For the Sicherheitspolizei, it represented their greatest operational failure and their most brutal suppression operation. The organization that had efficiently liquidated ghettos and conducted mass executions across occupied Europe suddenly found itself fighting a desperate urban battle against organized military resistance. The initial German response revealed how unprepared the SiPo was for sustained military confrontation. Warsaw's SiPo garrison numbered approximately 2,500 personnel, Gestapo officers, Kripo detectives, SD intelligence agents, and security guards. These were police, not soldiers. They were trained for interrogation, surveillance, arrest operations. They were not trained for combat against organized military units in urban terrain. On the first day of the uprising, Home Army fighters overran several SiPo officers, killing officers and seizing weapons and files. The SiPo headquarters at Sucha Avenue became a besieged fortress. The comfortable occupation routine, arrests, interrogations, deportations conducted without resistance, collapsed instantly into urban warfare for which the SiPo was fundamentally unprepared. The arrival of SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski to command suppression operations on August 5th marked a significant shift. Bach-Zelewski was a specialist in anti-partisan warfare, experienced in brutal clearance operations across occupied Soviet territories. His appointment placed military professionals in command, with the SiPo subordinated to overall military coordination. This revealed an important truth about the Sicherheitspolizei. They were effective against unarmed or lightly armed populations, but lacked the training and equipment for sustained military combat. Zaleski brought regular Wehrmacht units, heavy artillery, armoured vehicles, and combat-experienced Waffen-SS formations. The suppression would still involve SiPo personnel extensively, but they would operate under military command using military methods. The Wola district massacre in the uprising's first week demonstrated the SiPo's reversion to their core capability: mass murder of civilians. Unable to distinguish resistance fighters from civilian population and lacking the urban combat skills to clear buildings efficiently, the SiPo and their auxiliary units simply murdered everyone they encountered. Between August 5th and 7th, approximately 40,000 to 50,000 civilians in Wola district were executed in the uprising's largest single massacre. The killings were conducted by SiPo-directed units including the Derlewanger Brigade, a penal unit composed of convicted criminals commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Oskar Derlewanger, and the Kaminsky Brigade, Russian collaborationist forces. The SiPo provided command coordination, target identification, and administrative oversight while the auxiliary units conducted the actual killing. The massacre served no military purpose. Most victims were elderly women and children who posed no combat threat. It was terrorism designed to break resistance morale. The subsequent phase of suppression revealed the SiPo's role in systematic urban destruction. As Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units cleared districts through conventional military assault, the SiPo followed to eliminate remaining resistance, interrogate prisoners, and identify underground organisation members. They brought their specialised skills to urban combat, intelligence analysis to identify resistance leadership, interrogation techniques to extract information from prisoners, record-keeping to document captured personnel. The SiPo established temporary detention and interrogation centres in each cleared district, processing thousands of prisoners. Those identified as resistance fighters were executed immediately. Those believed to possess intelligence value were interrogated using torture. Those classified as civilians were often sent to concentration camps or used as human shields during subsequent assaults. The sewer warfare illustrated the SiPo's adaptation to unique urban combat challenges. Warsaw's extensive sewer system allowed resistance fighters to move between districts and escape encirclement. The SiPo responded by flooding sections of sewers, dropping grenades through manholes, and using trained dogs to hunt people in the tunnels. They interrogated captured fighters to map the underground network. They employed specialised equipment including listening devices and toxic gas to clear sewer sections. This required operational creativity beyond normal SiPo police work, revealing some organisational flexibility, but the methods remained characteristically brutal. Prisoners who revealed sewer routes were executed after providing information, ensuring they couldn't warn others of compromised passages. The treatment of Polish civilians during suppression operations revealed the SiPo's continued role in population management despite the military context. As each district fell, the SiPo organised mass evacuations, separating military-age males from women, children, and elderly. The males were interrogated to identify resistance members, then sent to POW camps or executed. Women and children were deported to labour camps or processed as refugees. The SiPo coordinated these mass population movements with the same administrative efficiency they'd applied to ghetto liquidations, manifest lists, transport schedules, destination assignments. Even in the chaos of urban warfare, they maintained bureaucratic procedures. The uprising's collapse in early October 1944 came not from SiPo effectiveness, but from overwhelming German military force and the Soviet Army's failure to support the uprising. The Home Army, running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, negotiated surrender on October 2nd. The Germans granted combatant status to resistance fighters, a significant concession allowing them power protections rather than summary execution as terrorists. But this concession didn't extend to civilians. After suppression, the SiPo coordinated the systematic demolition of what remained of Warsaw. Hitler had ordered the city's complete destruction as punishment for resistance. The SiPo supervised specialized German demolition units that spent months systematically destroying buildings, block by block, reducing approximately 85% of the city to rubble. Warsaw's pre-war population of 1.3 million was reduced to approximately 1,000 people by January 1945. Those remaining were demolition workers and SiPo personnel overseeing destruction. The casualty statistics from the Warsaw Uprising revealed its catastrophic human cost and the SiPo's role in that cost. Approximately 16,000 Home Army fighters died, along with an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 Polish civilians, most killed in deliberate massacres rather than combat. German forces lost approximately 17,000 killed or wounded, including approximately 2,000 security police and auxiliaries. The disproportionate civilian casualties reflected the SiPo's anti-partisan doctrine applied to urban warfare, treating entire populations as legitimate targets because they supported or might support resistance. The strategy was militarily effective. It did break resistance, but it required genocide-level civilian casualties to achieve. The intelligence failure that preceded the uprising raised questions about SiPo effectiveness that Nazi leadership never fully addressed. The Home Army had been preparing the uprising for months, accumulating weapons, planning operations, recruiting fighters. Warsaw's SiPo offices had massive surveillance networks, thousands of informants, interrogation programs targeting resistance suspects. Yet they failed to detect or prevent the uprising's launch. This intelligence failure suggested either that Polish resistance had developed extremely effective security procedures or that the SiPo's intelligence networks were less comprehensive than claimed. Post-war analysis suggests both factors contributed. The Home Army did maintain strict operational security, and the SiPo had become overconfident in their control, dismissing signs of preparation as insignificant. The Warsaw Uprising marked a turning point in how the SiPo was perceived both by occupied populations and by German leadership. For occupied populations, Warsaw demonstrated that even the SiPo could be fought militarily, even if such fighting ended in defeat. The uprising inspired resistance movements across Europe, even as it demonstrated the catastrophic costs of premature revolt. For German leadership, Warsaw revealed that the SiPo, despite its effectiveness at terror and repression, could not guarantee security in the face of organized military resistance and collapsing German military position. The invincible security apparatus that Heydrich had built was showing cracks. As Soviet and Allied armies advanced from east and west, the SiPo would face increasing resistance, deteriorating morale, and the approaching reckoning for their crimes. April 10th, 1961, Jerusalem, Israel. Adolf Eichmann sat in a bulletproof glass booth in an Israeli courtroom, listening to Holocaust survivors testify about the deportation machinery he had administered. The testimony was devastating. Families torn apart, children gassed, entire communities destroyed. Eichmann's response, when his turn came, was bureaucratic self-justification. He had followed orders. He had done his duty. He had never personally killed anyone. His role was administrative, arranging trains, coordinating schedules, processing paperwork. The gas chambers, the shooting pits, the death marches, those were someone else's responsibility. He was just a transportation officer. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, would later describe him as embodying the banality of evil. Not a sadistic monster, but a mediocre bureaucrat who committed monstrous crimes through unthinking obedience and career ambition. But was that explanation sufficient? How did thousands of ordinary Germans, police officers, lawyers, clerks, administrators, become accomplices in genocide? The recruitment and training of SiPo personnel provided the first clues. The Sicherheitspolizei drew heavily from educated middle-class Germans. Approximately 45% of Einsatzgruppen leaders held doctoral degrees in law, philosophy, or economics. They weren't society's misfits or violent criminals, but its achievers. Many had joined the police or civil service during the Weimar Republic, before the Nazis came to power. They became SiPo officers not through ideological zealotry, but through career continuity as their institutions were Nazified. The transition from investigating crimes to committing them happened gradually. First, arrests of political opponents, then deportation, coordination, finally participation in mass killing. The incremental nature of this progression allowed individuals to rationalize each step without confronting the ultimate destination. Ideological indoctrination provided the justification framework that enabled participation. The SiPo's training schools in Berlin, Charlottenburg, and Prague included extensive ideological education alongside tactical training. Instructors taught that Jews, communists, and Slavic peoples represented existential threats to Germany requiring elimination. They framed mass killing not as murder but as defensive action protecting the German nation from biological and political enemies. This ideological framework provided perpetrators with a moral justification. They weren't committing crimes, but fulfilling necessary duties. Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, commander of Einsatzgruppe D, later testified that he viewed the murder of 90,000 Jews as a difficult but necessary task, required by the war situation. The ideology transformed murder into duty. The psychological mechanisms that enabled participation in atrocities have been studied extensively by scholars seeking to understand how normal people commit extraordinary evil. Physical distance from killing helped. Officers who planned operations killed fewer people personally than those who pulled triggers, allowing them to avoid emotional confrontation with their victims. Bureaucratic language created emotional distance. People became units, murder became special treatment, genocide became the final solution. Division of labour diffused responsibility. The officer who compiled arrest lists didn't pull triggers. The officer who drove victims to execution sites didn't issue orders. The officer who pulled triggers didn't decide who died. No individual felt fully responsible for the ultimate outcome. Peer pressure and conformity to group norms powerfully influenced individual behaviour. Testimonies from post-war trials revealed that SiPo officers who expressed moral objections to killings were often mocked as weak or politically unreliable. Few men wanted to appear cowardly or squeamish before their colleagues. The desire to fit in, to not stand out, to meet group expectations, these ordinary social pressures operated even in contexts of mass murder. Christopher Browning's study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 documented how ordinary middle-aged German policemen became killers in occupied Poland, partly through peer pressure and group conformity. The few who requested not to participate in shootings generally weren't punished but were socially ostracised, suggesting individual agency existed but was rarely exercised. Career advancement incentivized cooperation with increasingly criminal orders. Promotion within the SiPo required demonstrating effectiveness, following orders without question, and showing ideological commitment. Officers who efficiently executed deportation, operations, or anti-partisan campaigns received promotions and better postings. Those who objected or resisted were sidelined into backwater assignments. This created a selection effect. The most ruthless and compliant officers rose through ranks, while the less committed remained in minor positions. By mid-war, the SiPo's senior leadership consisted almost entirely of men who had proven their willingness to commit atrocities. The career incentive structure rewarded evil. Yet evidence suggests that opting out was possible, contradicting post-war claims that refusing orders meant execution. Testimonies revealed cases of SiPo officers who requested transfer from Einsatzgruppen duty or asked not to participate in shootings, and most were accommodated without facing execution or imprisonment. Some were transferred to other duties, some were given administrative roles that didn't involve direct killing. The system generally allowed individual opt-out while ensuring overall operations continued. This evidence was devastating to post-war defences. Perpetrators participated not because they would be killed for refusing, but because they chose not to refuse. Whether from ideology, career, ambition, peer pressure, or simply taking the path of least resistance, they made choices that enabled genocide. Alcohol consumption played a surprisingly significant role in enabling participation. Multiple testimonies described heavy drinking before and after mass shooting operations. The SiPo routinely distributed alcohol to units conducting executions, understanding that intoxication made killing easier psychologically. Some perpetrators described shooting operations as only tolerable while intoxicated. This suggests that even with ideological indoctrination and bureaucratic distance, many perpetrators found the reality of face-to-face killing psychologically difficult. Rather than interpreting this as evidence of conscience, it's more accurate to view it as evidence that human psychology resists killing, even when that resistance can be overcome through alcohol, ideology, and group pressure. The long-term psychological consequences for perpetrators revealed the enduring human cost of participation. Post-war psychiatric evaluations of SiPo veterans documented high rates of PTSD, depression, nightmares, and alcohol dependency. Some perpetrators committed suicide decades after the war. Others required psychiatric treatment. A few expressed genuine remorse, though many maintained defensive justifications until death. The psychological toll suggests that despite all the ideological indoctrination and bureaucratic distancing, participating in mass murder damaged perpetrators psychologically. They paid a price, though nothing comparable to the price their victims paid. The question remains whether that psychological suffering represented conscience or merely the psychological difficulty of violating human behavioral norms. The comparative studies of perpetrator psychology, Stanford Prison Experiment, Milgram Obedience Research. Studies of other genocides suggest that the SiPo perpetrators were not uniquely evil, but rather ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances who made terrible choices. This universality is both disturbing and important. Disturbing because it suggests that, under certain circumstances, many ordinary people might participate in atrocities. Important because it indicates that preventing genocide requires institutional safeguards and moral education, not simply identifying and removing supposedly evil individuals. The SiPo perpetrators were products of specific historical, institutional, and ideological circumstances. Different circumstances might have made them routine policemen investigating burglaries rather than perpetrators of the Holocaust. The question of whether all SiPo members were equally culpable remained contentious in post-war German society. Some argued that low-level clerks who processed paperwork weren't morally equivalent to Einsatzgruppenshooters. Others insisted that everyone who participated in the apparatus bore responsibility, regardless of their specific role. German courts generally distinguished between different levels of participation, with harsher sentences for those who directly killed versus those who provided administrative support. But this legal distinction perhaps missed a crucial point. The Holocaust required both shooters and clerks. The mass murder couldn't have functioned without both the men who pulled triggers and the men who scheduled trains. Both were necessary, both were complicit. The SiPo had created a division of labour in genocide where thousands shared responsibility and no individual bore complete responsibility, allowing each to tell themselves their particular role wasn't that important. It was a bureaucratic distribution of guilt that made accountability almost impossible to achieve. July 2nd, 1941, Riga, Latvia. Victors. Arais walked into the SiPo headquarters in newly occupied Riga and offered his services. The Wehrmacht had captured Latvia barely a week earlier, and already the SiPo was organising local auxiliary forces. Arais, a 31-year-old former law student with strongly anti-communist and anti-Semitic views, proposed forming a Latvian volunteer unit to assist German security operations. The SiPo accepted immediately. Within days, the Heydrich Commando numbered over 300 Latvian volunteers eager to participate in anti-partisan and anti-Jewish actions. By war's end, they would be responsible for murdering approximately 26,000 Jews in Latvia and Belarus, participating in dozens of mass shooting operations under SiPo direction. The Heydrich Commando represented one of hundreds of similar auxiliary formations across occupied Europe, revealing an uncomfortable truth. The Holocaust's scope and efficiency required extensive local collaboration that the SiPo systematically cultivated and exploited. The scale of collaboration was staggering. Across occupied territories, approximately 300,000 local auxiliaries served in police formations coordinated or commanded by the SiPo. In Ukraine, police battalions numbered perhaps 120,000 at peak strength. In the Baltic states, tens of thousands more. In occupied Soviet territories, Cossack formations, Russian collaborationist units, and various ethnic militias all participated in SiPo-directed operations. In Western Europe, collaboration took different forms. French milice, Belgian fascist groups, Dutch police who assisted deportations, but the pattern remained consistent. Local populations providing manpower that extended the SiPo's reach far beyond what German personnel alone could achieve. The motivations for collaboration varied significantly, but generally fell into several categories. Ideological commitment motivated some. Genuine anti-Semites who welcomed the opportunity to persecute Jews. Anti-communists who viewed Germans as liberators from Soviet occupation. Fascists and extreme nationalists who aligned with Nazi ideology. The Baltic states, annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, produced many collaborators who viewed German occupation as preferable to Soviet rule and were willing to participate in Nazi operations in exchange for promises of future independence. Ukrainian nationalism similarly motivated collaboration, with some nationalist factions viewing Germans as potential allies against Soviet and Polish domination. Economic survival motivated others. Auxiliary police received better rations than civilians in occupied territories where food scarcity created near-starvation conditions. They received regular wages, their families gained protection, they could loot victims' property. For people facing genuine starvation, joining auxiliary forces represented survival. The SiPo understood this desperation and exploited it systematically, offering material incentives that made collaboration attractive, regardless of ideology. The moral calculus became brutally simple: participate in persecution or watch your family starve. Many chose collaboration. Coercion motivated still others, particularly among Soviet POWs. The Wehrmacht captured approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers during the war, and conditions in POW camps were horrific. Starvation, disease, exposure killed over 3 million. German authorities offered Soviet POWs a choice: remain in camps and likely die, or volunteer for auxiliary service and receive food, shelter, and relative safety. Tens of thousands accepted this deal, forming Hilfswilliger volunteer helper units that served in various capacities, including as SiPo auxiliaries. These men faced impossible choices between slow death through starvation or survival through collaboration, and many chose survival. Whether this constituted genuine volunteering or coerced cooperation remained morally and legally ambiguous. The training of auxiliary forces revealed the SiPo's systematic approach to building collaborative relationships. At Trawnicki camp in occupied Poland, the SiPo established a training facility that processed approximately 5,000 Ukrainian, Latvian, and Lithuanian auxiliaries who would serve in Action Reinhard death camps and ghetto liquidations. Training combined basic military skills, weapons handling, unit tactics with ideological indoctrination, emphasizing Jewish threat narratives and anti-communist ideology. The Trawnicki men, as they became known, proved devastatingly effective. They guarded Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec death camps, participated in ghetto liquidations across Poland, and assisted in countless mass shooting operations. The SiPo had created a systematic program for converting foreign nationals into Holocaust perpetrators. The operational division of labour between German SiPo officers and local auxiliaries revealed a calculated approach to perpetration. German officers typically provided command, planning, and supervision, while auxiliaries provided manpower for direct killing. This arrangement offered several advantages. It conserved German personnel for specialised tasks, it implicated local populations in German crimes, and it created psychological distance for German officers from hands-on violence. A typical Einsatzgruppen operation might involve 20 German SiPo officers planning and supervising, while 200 Lithuanian or Ukrainian auxiliaries conducted the actual roundup and shooting. Post-war, this division made accountability complicated. German officers claimed they only planned operations, auxiliaries claimed they only followed German orders. The 9th Fort massacre outside Kaunas, Lithuania, on October 29, 1941, demonstrated this collaborative model at its most deadly. Einsatzkommando 3, under German command, organised the operation. Lithuanian auxiliary police of the Patingesis Boris Special Squad conducted the roundup and killing. In a single day, they murdered 9,200 Jewish men, women, and children from Kaunas ghetto. The operation required extensive coordination. The German SiPo provided overall direction, compiled victim lists, arranged transportation, and supervised execution sites. The Lithuanian auxiliaries performed the labour-intensive work of forcing thousands of people from the ghetto, marching them to the 9th Fort, and conducting the shooting. This force multiplication allowed relatively small German security contingents to control and murder populations that vastly outnumbered them. The post-war fate of collaborators revealed significant gaps in justice. Many auxiliary force members escaped prosecution entirely. Some fled to Western Europe or the Americas as displaced persons, hiding their collaboration histories. Others returned to their home countries, and prosecution depended on political circumstances. Soviet authorities executed or imprisoned many collaborators who fell into their hands, though with uncertain accuracy and questionable due process. Western nations were more lenient. Many admitted collaborators as refugees without thorough background checks, sometimes deliberately because Cold War politics valued anti-communists regardless of wartime activities. The result was that thousands of Holocaust perpetrators lived peacefully in post-war Western societies, their crimes unpunished and often unknown to their neighbours. The controversy over collaboration versus coercion persisted in post-war debates. Some historians argued that collaboration was fundamentally voluntary and morally indefensible, regardless of circumstances. Others emphasized the impossible situations occupied populations faced, noting that refusing to participate might mean death for oneself and one's family. The truth likely varied by individual. Some auxiliaries enthusiastically embraced Nazi ideology and participated willingly in atrocities. Others cooperated under duress while seeking opportunities to minimize harm. Still others acted from purely opportunistic motives without strong ideological commitment. But the variation in individual motivation didn't change the aggregate outcome. Hundreds of thousands of local auxiliaries extended the SiPo's capacity for mass murder far beyond what German forces alone could achieve. The use of auxiliary forces also revealed Nazi racial ideology's flexibility when pragmatism demanded. The Nazis considered Slavic peoples racially inferior, yet they armed and empowered hundreds of thousands of Slavic auxiliaries. They viewed Lithuanians, Latvians, and Ukrainians as untermensch subhumans, yet they trusted them to conduct critical security operations. This contradiction suggests that Nazi ideology, while genuine, was also instrumental applied when convenient, ignored when inconvenient. The SiPo's willingness to collaborate with people they officially despised demonstrated that operational effectiveness often trumped ideological purity when the two conflicted. The collaboration phenomenon extended beyond military and police auxiliaries to include informant networks. The SiPo cultivated tens of thousands of civilian informants across occupied territories, ordinary people who reported on their neighbours for ideological reasons, personal grudges, or material rewards. These informants provided intelligence that enabled targeted arrests, revealed hidden Jews, identified resistance members. The Netherlands alone may have had 10,000 or more active informants who assisted German authorities in locating Jews in hiding. Anne Frank's hiding place was discovered through informant betrayal. The pervasiveness of informant networks created an atmosphere of distrust that fragmented resistance and enabled German control with relatively small occupation forces. The most disturbing aspect of the collaboration phenomenon was how ordinary it became. Local police in occupied territories routinely participated in roundups and deportations. Civilian auxiliaries served as guards at ghettos and camps. Thousands of ordinary people accepted or actively supported Nazi persecution in exchange for material benefits, ideological satisfaction, or simply continued employment. This normalized collaboration revealed how quickly moral norms could shift under occupation, how easily people could rationalize participation in atrocities, and how the SiPo's genius lay partly in understanding how to exploit human weakness, fear, and opportunism. The collaborators extended the SiPo's reach across a continent and implicated entire societies in genocide, ensuring that the Holocaust was not merely a German crime, but a crime enabled by collaboration across occupied Europe. January 18th, 1945. Auschwitz-Birkenau, occupied Poland. The SiPo officers at Auschwitz-Birkenau faced a desperate situation as Soviet artillery rumbled in the distance. The camp held approximately 67,000 prisoners, living witnesses to 18 months of industrial-scale murder. Evidence of genocide filled the compound. Gas chambers, crematoria, warehouses of victims' belongings, mass graves. The approaching Red Army would discover everything unless the SiPo acted immediately. They chose evacuation over liberation. In temperatures below 0 Celsius, they forced approximately 58,000 prisoners onto roads heading west, death marches into the Reich interior. Those too weak to walk were shot. The columns would stretch 60 miles, leaving corpses along roadsides in a trail of death visible from the air. Approximately 15,000 prisoners would die during the march. The SiPo was no longer efficiently murdering victims in gas chambers. They were desperately killing witnesses before Allied forces could hear their testimony. The collapse of Nazi Germany forced the Sicherheitspolizei to transition from confident occupiers to desperate fugitives in barely 18 months. In mid-1943, the SiPo controlled security across occupied Europe from France to Ukraine. By April 1945, they controlled only shrinking pockets of German territory. This collapse revealed the organization's fundamental nature. It had been effective at repressing defenseless populations, but proved unable to prevent military defeat. As Wehrmacht fronts crumbled, the SiPo's apparatus of control crumbled with them. Deportation machinery ceased functioning when railways were destroyed, surveillance networks dissolved when occupation ended, concentration camps were liberated. The comprehensive security state the SiPo had built proved remarkably fragile when subjected to military pressure. The acceleration of killing in the final months demonstrated the SiPo's priorities even in defeat. Despite desperate military situations and collapsing infrastructure, they continued murdering prisoners through early 1945. The Mauthausen concentration camp conducted executions until May 3, 1945, 5 days before German surrender. Hungarian Jews were still being deported to Auschwitz in summer 1944, even as Soviet forces approached from the east. This continuation of genocide during military collapse revealed that the final solution had become an end unto itself, pursued even when it actively harmed Germany's war effort. The SiPo's ideological commitment to extermination exceeded rational calculation of strategic benefit. The systematic destruction of evidence became a SiPo priority as defeat loomed. In RSHA headquarters at Prinz-Albrecht-Straße, 8 clerks spent final weeks burning files. Teletyped orders went to field offices: destroy records, burn correspondence, eliminate documentation. The Action Reinhard camps Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec were demolished in 1943, their buildings destroyed, mass graves ploughed over, forests planted to conceal sites. This evidence destruction was only partially successful. The Nazis had documented their crimes too thoroughly. Even aggressive destruction programs left vast quantities of incriminating evidence for Allied forces to capture. But the attempt revealed consciousness of guilt. The SiPo understood their operations constituted crimes requiring concealment. The death marches of winter 1944 through spring 1945 represented the SiPo's final mass atrocity. As Allied armies approached concentration camps from east and west, the SiPo evacuated prisoners rather than allow liberation. These evacuations served no strategic military purpose. Prisoners could have been left to be liberated or simply shot at the camps. Instead, the SiPo forced hundreds of thousands onto roads in winter, marching them hundreds of kilometres to camps further from front lines. Approximately 250,000 prisoners were subjected to death marches. Approximately 100,000 died from exposure, starvation, exhaustion, or execution when they couldn't continue. The death marches revealed the SiPo's priorities. Preventing prisoner liberation mattered more than any rational wartime objective. Individual SiPo personnel responded to imminent defeat through various strategies. Some fled westward toward American and British lines, preferring Western capture to Soviet captivity. Others attempted to disguise their identities, destroying SS identification documents, removing SS blood group tattoos through self-mutilation or crude surgery, obtaining false papers. Many simply changed into civilian clothes and attempted to blend into displaced person camps and refugee columns. The organisational discipline that had characterised the SiPo throughout its existence dissolved as officers prioritised personal survival, units fragmented, command structures broke down, operational coordination ceased. By April 1945, the Sicherheitspolizei existed more as scattered remnants than coherent organisation. The disappearance of Heinrich Müller exemplified the chaos of the final days. Müller, Gestapo chief since 1939, was last reliably seen in Hitler's bunker on May 1, 1945. He vanished without trace, leaving no body, no grave, no credible sightings. Various theories emerged: death during Berlin's final battle, escape to South America, even defection to the Soviet Union as a recruited agent. The truth remains unknown. That the head of the Gestapo could disappear so completely suggested both the chaos of Germany's final days and the possibilities for escape that high-ranking SiPo officers possessed. Müller's disappearance haunted post-war justice efforts. One of the Holocaust's primary administrators simply vanished. Suicide rates among SiPo leadership revealed a final accounting with their crimes. Heinrich Himmler committed suicide by cyanide capsule after British capture on May 23, 1945. Richard Glucks, who oversaw the concentration camp inspectorate, disappeared in May 1945, likely suicide. Numerous regional SiPo commanders and camp commandants committed suicide as Allied forces approached. These suicides reflected various motivations: fear of trial and execution, recognition of guilt, despair at defeat, inability to face consequences for their actions. The pattern suggested that at least some SiPo personnel understood the magnitude of their crimes and chose death over accountability. Others, however, attempted to portray themselves as legitimate security professionals who had merely followed orders. In the confused immediate post-war period, some SiPo officers successfully reinvented themselves. They claimed to have been administrative personnel without knowledge of atrocities. They emphasized their police training and investigative experience while minimizing their participation in deportations and killings. They offered their services to Allied intelligence agencies, claiming expertise on communism and Soviet intelligence that might prove valuable in the emerging Cold War. Some of these offers were accepted. Western intelligence agencies recruited former Nazi intelligence personnel, prioritizing Cold War advantage over justice for wartime crimes. The physical infrastructure of the SiPo's apparatus fell into Allied hands, intact enough to provide damning evidence. Captured facilities contained filing systems, documenting arrests, deportation records, tracking trains and victims, property inventories, cataloguing confiscated goods, personnel files identifying thousands of SiPo officers. The meticulous record-keeping that characterized SiPo operations intended to demonstrate bureaucratic legitimacy now provided comprehensive documentation of crimes. The RSHA files captured in Berlin filled multiple warehouses. The records seized at campsites documented industrial-scale murder. The evidence was so extensive that denying Holocaust history would require rejecting massive quantities of contemporary documentation created by perpetrators themselves. Yet the SiPo's collapse was never truly complete. The organization was dismantled, its operations ceased, its personnel scattered. But the individual officers survived in numbers sufficient to create problems for post-war justice. Of approximately 12,000 senior SiPo officers, only a small fraction were captured immediately. Others escaped, hid, assumed new identities, fled abroad. The incomplete reckoning with SiPo crimes would haunt post-war Germany for decades, as former officers surfaced in government positions, business leadership, and everyday civilian life. The Sicherheitspolizei as an organization ended in spring 1945, but its members persisted, carrying their crimes into post-war society, where justice would prove elusive and accountability incomplete. April 15th, 1945, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Germany. British soldiers of the 11th Armoured Division entered Bergen-Belsen expecting a prisoner of war camp. What they found defied comprehension. Approximately 60,000 prisoners, most near death from starvation and typhus, wandered among 13,000 unburied corpses. The camp's water system had failed. Sanitation had collapsed. Disease spread unchecked. Survivors were so emaciated that soldiers initially mistook them for children until realizing they were adults whose bodies had been reduced to skeletal frames. One British medical officer later wrote that nothing in his training had prepared him for what he witnessed. Piles of bodies stacked like cordwood, living prisoners too weak to move, lying beside dead cellmates, the overwhelming stench of death and disease. This was Bergen-Belsen after the SiPo and SS had abandoned it. This was what liberation looked like. When it came too late for tens of thousands, the Allied discovery of concentration camps and mass graves across liberated territories forced a confrontation with crimes that exceeded any precedent in international law. American forces liberating Dachau on April 29th found 39 railroad cars containing approximately 2,000 corpses, a death train that never completed its evacuation journey. Soviet forces entering Majdanek in July 1944 found gas chambers and crematoria still intact, documentation of approximately 78,000 murders. The Auschwitz liberation on January 27, 1945, revealed the industrial infrastructure of genocide. 5 crematoria, gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, warehouses containing 7 tons of human hair and hundreds of thousands of items of clothing. Each liberation provided evidence of systematic mass murder administered through bureaucratic efficiency. The psychological impact on Liberating soldiers was profound and lasting. Many had experienced combat, witnessed battlefield deaths, seen war's brutality, but nothing prepared them for the concentration camps. American General Dwight Eisenhower, touring Ohlendorf camp, ordered extensive photographic documentation and required local German civilians to tour the site, understanding that future generations might struggle to believe such atrocities occurred. British soldiers liberating Bergen-Belsen were so traumatized that many required psychological treatment for what would later be recognized as PTSD. Soviet soldiers who had witnessed Nazi brutality throughout the Eastern Front campaigns were nonetheless shocked by the systematic industrial nature of the killing revealed at camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek. The capture of SiPo personnel provided the first opportunities for interrogation and accountability. Approximately 12,000 SiPo officers were captured by Allied forces in the war's final months, though many thousands more escaped. The captured personnel initially attempted various defences. They were merely administrators, they had no knowledge of killings, they followed orders, they would have been executed for refusing. These defences collapsed when confronted with documentary evidence. The SiPo's obsessive record-keeping became their undoing. Files captured at RSHA headquarters documented who ordered what, when, and to what purpose. Transport manifests listed deportation trains. Execution reports tallied victims by location and date. Personnel files identified who served where and in what capacity. The Allies faced immediate practical challenges in processing vast numbers of prisoners and witnesses. Displaced persons camps swelled with millions of refugees, survivors, collaborators, and fugitives, all mixed together in chaotic conditions. Identifying SiPo officers among this mass required extensive interrogations. Some were identified by their SS blood group tattoos, though many had removed these through self-mutilation. Others were identified by survivors who recognized them from camps or ghettos. Still others were identified through captured personnel records that listed assignments and ranks. The process was slow, incomplete, and complicated by the sheer scale of displacement and the ease with which war criminals could obtain false papers and blend into refugee populations. The differential treatment of captured SiPo personnel by different Allied powers created significant disparities in justice. The Soviet Union executed many captured SiPo officers after summary trials, or simply shot them upon capture. Western Allies generally processed prisoners through formal procedures, segregating suspected war criminals for future trials. This meant that SiPo officers captured in the East faced immediate, harsh justice, while those captured in the West faced uncertainty but also possibilities for escape or leniency. Some SiPo personnel deliberately fled westward, precisely to avoid Soviet capture, understanding that Western justice might be more forgiving or more escapable. The intelligence value of captured SiPo officers created moral complications for the emerging Cold War. The SiPo had operated extensive intelligence networks in Soviet-occupied territories. They possessed information about Soviet security services, Communist Party structures, and occupation policies that Western intelligence agencies desperately wanted. This created situations where SiPo officers with significant war crimes accusations could negotiate lenient treatment in exchange for intelligence cooperation. Reinhard Gehlen, who had commanded Wehrmacht intelligence on the Eastern Front and worked closely with the SiPo, was recruited by American intelligence and eventually became head of West German foreign intelligence, despite significant complicity in war crimes. Similar accommodations extended to some SiPo officers whose intelligence value exceeded their accountability for atrocities. The documentation captured by Allies provided the evidentiary foundation for prosecutions. The Nazis had documented their crimes in extraordinary detail, creating a comprehensive administrative record of genocide. The RSHA files captured in Berlin included correspondence between SiPo officers coordinating deportations, statistical reports on killing operations, and bureaucratic memoranda discussing implementation of the final solution. The Einsatzgruppen reports, filed with RSHA headquarters, documented mass shootings with statistical precision. The camp records detailed arrivals, selections, and deaths. This documentary evidence made denial impossible and provided prosecutors with contemporary documentation created by perpetrators themselves, far more credible than eyewitness testimony alone. The initial confusion among Allied forces about the distinctions between different SS branches gradually resolved through investigation and interrogation. Early in the occupation, Allied personnel often treated all SS members as equally culpable. But investigation revealed significant operational differences between the Waffen-SS combat units, the concentration camp Totenkopfverbände, the SiPo's police functions, and the SD's intelligence operations. These distinctions mattered for prosecution. Being an SS member wasn't itself proof of war crimes, but being a SiPo officer in an Einsatzgruppe or working at an extermination camp established strong presumptions of criminal involvement. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg would eventually declare the Gestapo and SD criminal organizations, meaning membership itself constituted evidence of participation in criminal conspiracy. The physical evidence from liberated camps and mass grave sites provided undeniable proof of systematic murder. Soviet investigators exhumed mass graves at Babi Yar, finding remains of approximately 33,000 victims murdered in September 1941. Polish investigators at Treblinka discovered mass graves containing remains of approximately 800,000 victims. Forensic examinations of bodies revealed methods of killing, bullet wounds indicating mass shootings, evidence of carbon monoxide poisoning from gas chambers, signs of starvation and disease from camp conditions. This physical evidence corroborated documentary records and survivor testimony, creating a comprehensive evidentiary foundation for prosecution. The liberation also revealed the extent of property theft that had accompanied genocide. Warehouses at Auschwitz contained 7 tons of human hair, scheduled for shipment to German manufacturers who used it in textiles. Storerooms held hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes, clothing, eyeglasses, personal items, all confiscated from murder victims. Bank accounts in Switzerland held assets deposited by the Nazis from confiscated property. Gold fillings extracted from corpses had been processed into ingots stored in German bank vaults. The systematic theft that accompanied murder demonstrated that genocide had been economically profitable for the Nazi state, with the SiPo administering much of this confiscation bureaucracy. Yet liberation came too late for millions. Of the approximately 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, the vast majority died before Allied forces could reach them. The Einsatzgruppen massacres in Soviet territories occurred in 1941 and 1942, years before liberation. The Action Reinhard death camps operated in 1942 and 1943, murdering approximately 1.8 million before being demolished. By the time Allied forces liberated camps in 1945, most of the killing had already occurred. The camps that were liberated held survivors traumatized, damaged, reduced to extremes of suffering, but alive. The dead could not testify. Their stories survived only in documentation, in survivor testimony, in the physical evidence of mass graves and gas chambers. The confrontation with SiPo crimes forced Allied leadership to grapple with questions of justice, accountability, and how to respond to atrocities of unprecedented scale. Traditional laws of war provided no framework for prosecuting genocide as a distinct crime. The term itself was coined only in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin. The concept of crimes against humanity had to be developed to address the systematic murder of civilians based on identity rather than military necessity. The Nuremberg trials would establish these legal principles, but in the immediate liberation period, Allied forces operated without clear legal frameworks, making decisions about detention, investigation, and prosecution on an ad hoc basis that sometimes prioritized pragmatism over perfect justice. November 20th, 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. The defendants sat in 2 rows in the Palace of Justice. 22 of Nazi Germany's highest-ranking surviving officials facing charges before the International Military Tribunal. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer to stand trial, represented the Sicherheitspolizei in the dock. As Heydrich's successor leading the RSHA from January 1943 until war's end, Kaltenbrunner bore direct responsibility for Gestapo operations, deportations, and Einsatzgruppen killings. His defense would be that he held administrative authority only, that he never personally killed anyone, that he merely transmitted orders from Himmler and Hitler. The prosecution would present documents bearing his signature authorizing mass killings, witnesses who saw him visit concentration camps, and evidence that he commanded the apparatus that murdered millions. On October 1st, 1946, Kaltenbrunner was found guilty on counts 3 and 4, war crimes and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed October 16th, 1946, but he was one of the few SiPo leaders to face justice. Most escaped, hid, or received remarkably lenient treatment. The International Military Tribunal established crucial legal precedents, but prosecuted only a tiny fraction of perpetrators. The Nuremberg trial focused on major war criminals, government leaders, military commanders, organizational heads. The tribunal declared the Gestapo and SD to be criminal organizations, establishing that membership in these organizations after September 1939 constituted evidence of participation in criminal conspiracy. This declaration theoretically opened thousands of SiPo officers to prosecution. In practice, prosecution rates were shockingly low. The 4 occupation zones conducted subsequent trials. The American zone tried approximately 5,000 defendants in military tribunals. The British zone tried approximately 1,000. The French and Soviet zones conducted their own trials. But these numbers represented a small fraction of the tens of thousands of SiPo personnel who had participated in atrocities. The Einsatzgruppen trial at Nuremberg, conducted from September 1947 to April 1948, provided the most direct accountability for SiPo mass murder operations. 24 defendants, all senior Einsatzgruppen commanders or RSHA officers who directed their operations, faced charges for the murder of more than 1 million Jews in occupied Soviet territories. The prosecution presented the defendants' own reports. The Einsatzgruppen had filed detailed operational summaries documenting their killings as primary evidence. Otto Ohlendorf, commander of Einsatzgruppe D, testified with chilling bureaucratic precision about murdering 90,000 Jews, describing the process as distasteful but necessary duty. 14 defendants received death sentences, though only 4 were actually executed due to appeals, commutations, and Cold War politics reducing sentences. 2 defendants received life sentences, 5 received sentences of 10 to 20 years, and 3 were sentenced to time served. By 1951, none remained imprisoned. The rapid release of convicted SiPo officers reflected broader political dynamics that prioritized Cold War concerns over Holocaust justice. As tensions between Western allies and the Soviet Union intensified, West German cooperation became strategically valuable. This created pressure to rehabilitate German society quickly, which meant limiting prosecutions and releasing prisoners. The West German government lobbied extensively for sentence reductions and early releases, arguing that continued imprisonment hindered reconciliation and reconstruction. American High Commissioner John McCloy reviewed numerous cases in 1951, granting clemency to many convicted war criminals, including SiPo officers. The Cold War provided political cover for abandoning comprehensive justice in favor of strategic alliance building. The pursuit of Adolf Eichmann demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of Holocaust justice. Eichmann had escaped Allied custody in 1946 and fled to Argentina using Ratline's escape networks, often facilitated by sympathetic clergy and aided by forged documents. He lived openly in Argentina under his own name through the 1950s, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory. Israeli intelligence located him in 1960, and Mossad agents kidnapped him from Buenos Aires on May 11, 1960. His subsequent trial in Jerusalem became a watershed moment in Holocaust memory, providing survivors a public forum to testify and educating a generation about the final solution's bureaucratic machinery. Eichmann's defense that he merely followed orders, that he was a small cog in a large machine, was undermined by evidence showing his enthusiasm for deportation operations and his independent initiatives to accelerate killings. He was convicted on December 15th, 1961 and executed June 1st, 1962, one of only 2 Holocaust perpetrators ever executed by Israel. The West German justice system's handling of SiPo crimes revealed significant institutional reluctance to pursue comprehensive accountability. The Ludwigsburg Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, established in 1958, investigated thousands of cases but secured relatively few convictions. Legal obstacles, complicated prosecution, proving individual guilt in bureaucratic mass murder was difficult, statutes of limitations eliminated some charges, and the burden of proof remained high. More fundamentally, West German society in the 1950s and 60s showed limited enthusiasm for confronting the past. Many prosecutors, judges, and police officers were former Nazis themselves. Witnesses were often reluctant to testify. Juries proved sympathetic to defendants, claiming they merely followed orders. The Frankfurt-Auschwitz trials of 1963 through 1965 marked a turning point in German confrontation with Holocaust crimes. 22 defendants, mostly SS personnel who had served at Auschwitz, faced charges for participation in mass murder. The trial received extensive media coverage, educating younger Germans about atrocities many preferred to forget. The prosecution called hundreds of witnesses, many Holocaust survivors, who provided devastating testimony. Yet the sentences remained controversial. Many defendants received relatively light prison terms, some were acquitted, and even those convicted were often released early. The trials demonstrated both progress in confronting the past and the limits of legal accountability for industrial-scale genocide. The escape networks that enabled thousands of SiPo officers to evade justice operated with disturbing effectiveness. The so-called rat lines involved forged documents from sympathetic officials, safe houses provided by political or religious networks, and financial support from cashed Nazi funds or sympathetic benefactors. Key escape routes ran through Italy to South America, particularly Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Brazil. Some fugitives received assistance from anti-communist networks that valued their intelligence experience. Others were aided by Catholic clergy who provided false identity papers and sanctuary, sometimes from misplaced humanitarian concerns, sometimes from political sympathy. Estimates suggest 5,000 to 10,000 serious war criminals escaped to South America, including numerous SiPo officers who had commanded killing operations. The case of Klaus Barbie illustrated how thoroughly some SiPo officers evaded justice for decades. Barbie, Gestapo chief in Lyon, France, was responsible for torture, mass executions, and the deportation of 44 Jewish children to Auschwitz. He was recruited by American intelligence in 1947 for his knowledge of communist networks. When French authorities sought his extradition in 1950, American intelligence helped him escape to Bolivia, where he lived openly under his own name, working as a businessman and security consultant for Bolivian dictatorships. He wasn't arrested until 1983, tried in France in 1987, and finally convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991, having evaded justice for 43 years. The phenomenon of former SiPo officers in post-war West German society revealed the incomplete nature of denazification. By the mid-1950s, numerous former SiPo and Gestapo officers held positions in West German police forces, intelligence services, and government administration. Some achieved this through concealing their pasts, others were rehabilitated through Cold War priorities that valued anti-communist experience over accountability for war crimes. The West German Federal Intelligence Service, for example, employed numerous former SS and SiPo officers as analysts and agents. Local police forces in Bavaria and other states employed former Gestapo officers who possessed professional police training. This reintegration of perpetrators into post-war institutions compromised both justice and moral accountability. The trial of John Demjanjuk in 1988 demonstrated that Holocaust prosecutions could continue decades after the crimes. Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian who had served as a guard at Sobibor death camp under SiPo command, was denaturalized from American citizenship, extradited to Israel, and tried for war crimes. The case was complicated by mistaken identity issues. Prosecutors initially believed he was Ivan the Terrible, a particularly brutal guard at Treblinka, but eventually he was tried in Germany for his role at Sobibor. He was convicted in 2011 at age 91 and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, though he died before serving his sentence. The prosecution demonstrated that even low-level perpetrators could be held accountable decades later, though by then most were elderly or dead. The question of how many SiPo perpetrators escaped justice has no definitive answer, but rough estimates suggest the vast majority. Of approximately 47,000 SiPo and SD personnel who served during the war, perhaps 5,000 faced trial, and fewer than half were convicted. Conviction rates were highest immediately after the war and declined sharply through the 1950s as Cold War priorities superseded justice concerns. By the 1960s, most investigations focused on highest-profile cases like Eichmann, leaving thousands of lower-ranking perpetrators unprosecuted. Many lived into old age in Germany or abroad. never facing legal accountability. The statistical reality was that participation in the SiPo during the Holocaust carried relatively low risk of prosecution, especially for those who weren't in top leadership positions. The legacy of incomplete justice shaped post-war memory and accountability. Survivors lived with the knowledge that those who had murdered their families often went unpunished. The perpetrator's ability to escape or receive light sentences suggested that the international community's commitment to justice was limited and easily overwhelmed by other priorities. The message sent was ambiguous. Genocide was condemned in principle but prosecuted inconsistently in practice. This incomplete reckoning would influence how subsequent genocides were addressed, or more accurately, not addressed in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere. The SiPo crimes established that even industrial-scale bureaucratic murder could result in limited accountability, a lesson that future perpetrators would not fail to notice. January 20th, 2025, House of the Wannsee Conference Memorial, Berlin. A school group stands in the dining room where, 83 years earlier, 15 men coordinated the final solution over coffee and cognac. The villa overlooking Lake Wannsee has been preserved as a memorial and educational centre, the rooms where genocide was bureaucratically planned, now serving as space for historical confrontation. Display panels explain who attended, what was decided, how the meeting fit into the broader Holocaust machinery. The students are silent, struggling to reconcile the elegant villa with the monstrous purpose it served. Their teacher asks them to consider a question that has haunted historians for 8 decades. How did ordinary institutions, police forces, government bureaucracies, professional organizations become instruments of genocide? The answer matters not just for understanding the past, but for preventing future atrocities. The Sicherheitspolizei's transformation from law enforcement to mass murder apparatus offers lessons about institutional corruption, bureaucratic evil, and the fragility of civil society that remain urgently relevant. The historiography of the SiPo evolved significantly over the post-war decades, reflecting broader changes in Holocaust understanding. Immediately after the war, emphasis focused on Nazi leadership, Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich as uniquely evil individuals who imposed their will on German society. This interpretation portrayed the SiPo as an SS organization staffed by ideological fanatics, fundamentally different from normal police. By the 1960s and 70s, historians began examining broader institutional participation, recognizing that the SiPo drew heavily from career policemen and civil servants who weren't ideological extremists but professionals who adapted to Nazi requirements. Christopher Browning's 1992 study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 examined how ordinary middle-aged policemen became mass murderers in Poland, fundamentally challenging the fanatical SS narrative. Current scholarship recognizes the SiPo as a complex institution combining ideological true believers with careerist professionals and reluctant participants, all operating within structures that normalized atrocity. The institutional lessons from SiPo history remain profoundly relevant for modern democratic societies. The SiPo demonstrated how professional competence can be weaponized when legal constraints and democratic oversight are removed. Police skills, investigation, surveillance, record-keeping, arrest procedures became tools of persecution when directed toward ideologically defined enemies rather than legally defined crimes. The bureaucratic efficiency that made the SiPo effective at traffic enforcement or burglary investigation also made it effective at genocide when that became the assigned mission. This suggests that institutional safeguards, judicial oversight, legal constraints on police, power, democratic accountability, human rights protections are essential not because police are inherently evil, but because professional competence directed toward evil ends becomes catastrophically effective. Modern police organizations study SiPo history, though not always for the reasons one might hope. Democratic police forces examine the SiPo as a cautionary tale about what happens when law enforcement becomes subordinated to ideological objectives and loses judicial accountability. Police academy curricula in Germany and elsewhere include Holocaust education, emphasizing the importance of human rights, legal constraints, and individual moral responsibility in resisting illegal orders. But authoritarian regimes study the SiPo for different lessons: its effectiveness at social control, its surveillance methodologies, its success at preventing organized resistance. The Stasi in East Germany deliberately modelled aspects of their operations on Gestapo methods, Modern surveillance. States employ technologies the SiPo could only dream of, but pursue similar objectives. Comprehensive monitoring, preventive detention, elimination of opposition before it organizes. The comparison between the SiPo and other secret police organizations reveals both unique and universal elements. The Soviet NKVD, the East German Stasi, the Romanian Securitate, and contemporary secret police in authoritarian states all share characteristics with extensive surveillance networks, informant systems, detention without trial, torture in interrogation, political targeting of opposition. What made the SiPo unique was not its police-state methodology, but its genocidal application. Most secret police oppress their populations without attempting systematic extermination of entire ethnic groups. The SiPo combined police-state control with industrialized genocide in ways that remain historically unprecedented. Whether this uniqueness reflected German organizational efficiency, Nazi, ideological extremism, or specific historical circumstances remains debated. Memory politics surrounding the SiPo and Holocaust have been contentious and evolving. In Germany, confronting the past has been an ongoing process spanning generations. The immediate post-war period saw limited accountability and widespread desire to move forward without fully examining complicity. The 1960s brought increased attention through trials and education. The 1980s saw emotional debates about memory and responsibility. Today, Holocaust education is mandatory in German schools. Numerous memorials and museums document Nazi crimes, and confronting the past is considered essential to German democracy. But even now, debates continue about how much responsibility contemporary Germans bear for historical crimes, how Holocaust memory should be maintained as survivors die, and how to balance historical remembrance with forward-looking democratic development. Other nations' confrontation with their own collaboration with the SiPo has been slower and more contested. France officially acknowledged Vichy government complicity in Holocaust deportations only in 1995, 50 years after liberation. Poland has struggled with acknowledging both Polish victimization under Nazi occupation and Polish participation in anti-Jewish violence and collaboration. Ukraine's memory politics balance recognition of Ukrainian victimization with difficult questions about Ukrainian auxiliary forces who participated in Holocaust atrocities under SiPo direction. The Baltic states commemorate resistance to Soviet occupation while grappling with the reality that some resistance members had previously collaborated with Nazi occupation and participated in SiPo operations. These contested memories reveal how difficult it remains to acknowledge national complicity in genocide. The survivor testimony, archived in institutions like Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the USC Shoah Foundation, provides irreplaceable documentation of SiPo crimes from victims' perspectives. Video testimony projects have recorded tens of thousands of survivor interviews, preserving first-hand accounts before the generation that experienced the Holocaust passes. These testimonies consistently emphasize the SiPo's role. The Gestapo arrest in the middle of the night, the SiPo officer at the Umschlagplatz deciding who lived and died, the Ukrainian auxiliaries under SiPo command conducting roundups. The testimony humanizes statistics that might otherwise seem abstract. 6 million murdered becomes individual stories of families destroyed, communities erased, lives interrupted by violence administered through bureaucratic procedures. As survivors age and die, these recorded testimonies become increasingly important for education and historical memory. The question of what institutional safeguards prevent police organizations from becoming instruments of terror has occupied political scientists and human rights scholars for decades. The consensus emphasizes several essential protections: judicial independence, ensuring police actions can be legally challenged, legislative oversight providing accountability, free press, enabling public scrutiny, professional ethics emphasizing rule of law over political loyalty, international human rights standards limiting acceptable police practices, and perhaps most importantly, democratic culture that treats human rights as non-negotiable principles rather than flexible preferences. The SiPo operated in a system where all these safeguards had been systematically dismantled. German courts were subordinated to Nazi political priorities. The Reichstag was impotent after 1933, the press was controlled, professional ethics were replaced by ideological loyalty, human rights were dismissed as liberal weakness. Understanding how these protections were removed is as important as understanding what happened after their removal. The ongoing discovery of SiPo crimes into the 21st century demonstrates how much remains unknown despite extensive historical research. Mass graves continue to be discovered in Eastern Europe. Archives in former Soviet territories continue to yield documents. Forensic archaeology applies modern techniques to sites where evidence was concealed. Each discovery adds to the documented scope of SiPo crimes, while raising troubling questions about what else remains undiscovered. The Einsatzgruppen murdered approximately 1.5 million people, but the exact number and location of all victims remains unknown. The SiPo operations in occupied Soviet territories were so extensive and so effectively concealed that comprehensive accounting may never be possible. The unknown dead, buried in unmarked graves across Eastern Europe, represent the final dimension of SiPo crimes, not just murder, but the elimination of memory. The unanswered questions that remain about the SiPo tantalize historians and frustrate complete understanding. What happened to Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief who disappeared in May 1945? His fate remains unknown despite decades of investigation. How many SiPo officers escaped to South America or the Middle East? Estimates range from 5,000 to 15,000, but precise numbers are unknowable. What was the full extent of collaboration between the SiPo and local auxiliaries? New evidence continues to emerge, suggesting the scale was even larger than previously documented. How many people were murdered in total SiPo operations? The commonly cited 6 million Jewish victims doesn't include the hundreds of thousands killed in anti-partisan operations, the Romani victims, the political prisoners, the Soviet POWs. Comprehensive accounting remains impossible. The relevance of SiPo history extends beyond academic study to urgent contemporary questions. How should societies respond to refugees fleeing persecution, given that restrictive refugee policies in the 1930s contributed to Holocaust deaths? How should police powers be balanced against civil liberties, given that unlimited police authority enabled the SiPo's crimes? How should bureaucrats respond to illegal or immoral government orders, given that following orders was not accepted as a defense at Nuremberg? How should societies maintain vigilance against authoritarianism, given that Weimar Germany's democratic institutions were dismantled within months of Hitler's legal appointment as Chancellor? The SiPo's history provides no simple answers but clarifies the stakes of these questions. The transformation of the SiPo from police force to genocide apparatus represented one of history's most dramatic institutional corruptions. It demonstrated that professional competence doesn't protect against evil. In fact, professional competence makes evil more efficient when institutional purposes become corrupted. It showed that educated, middle-class professionals can participate in atrocities without being sadistic monsters, simply by treating genocide as administrative work requiring bureaucratic efficiency. It revealed that legal frameworks and judicial oversight are essential constraints on police power, because without them, police become instruments of whoever controls the state. And perhaps most disturbingly, it proved that these transformations can happen with shocking speed when democratic institutions are weak, when political culture tolerates authoritarianism, and when ideology provides justification for categorizing some humans as less than human. The students standing in the Wannsee Villa dining room, learning about the conference that coordinated the final solution, represent the future of Holocaust memory. As the generation that experienced the Holocaust personally passes away, maintaining historical memory becomes increasingly challenging, but also increasingly important. The SiPo's crimes must be remembered not as ancient history, but as relevant warning about what happens when institutional safeguards fail, when bureaucracy serves ideology, when police power operates without constraints, and when societies fail to defend human rights for all members. The shadow cast by the Sicherheitspolizei extends across 8 decades, a dark reminder that the capacity for organised evil exists within modern institutions, and that preventing future genocides requires eternal vigilance, robust, democratic institutions, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. The lessons written in the blood of millions demand that we never forget, never minimise, and never allow such horrors to recur.